Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the sun-drenched, dusty world of ancient Egypt. A place where time wasn't neatly ticked away by glowing screens or digital displays, but by the slow, deliberate crawl of shadows across the desert floor. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, oppressive heat of the midday sun beating down on vast, shimmering expanses of sand and stone. You're there, standing on the banks of the mighty Nile, the air thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and the distant bleating of goats. The only sound is the gentle lapping of water against a papyrus reed boat and the murmur of distant voices. Above you, the sky is an impossibly deep, unbroken blue, and the sun, a blazing orb, seems to hang suspended, a constant, unwavering presence. Your skin prickles with the heat, your eyes squinting against the glare, and you find yourself instinctively seeking the narrow strip of shade cast by a crumbling mud brick wall. In this world, without a clock in sight, how would you know when to start your day, when to break for a meal, or when the long, cool embrace of evening would finally arrive? It's a daunting thought, isn't it? You probably wouldn't survive a week without your phone's alarm, let alone trying to decipher the subtle shifts of sunlight to organize your entire life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the dry, warm air on your skin, a perpetual embrace that reminds you just how different this world is from your own climate-controlled existence. Here, in the cradle of civilization, the rhythms of life were dictated not by arbitrary numbers on a screen, but by the relentless, beautiful movements of the celestial bodies above. And for the ancient Egyptians, the most immediate, most undeniable celestial body was, of course, the sun. Imagine yourself as one of them, perhaps a farmer tending a small plot of barley along the Nile. Your day begins not with the piercing shriek of an alarm clock, but with the first faint blush of pre-dawn, light painting the eastern horizon. You rise, not by a predetermined hour, but by the internal clock that resonates with the natural world around you. As the sun begins its ascent, you notice something so fundamental yet so often overlooked in our modern, artificially lit lives: the shadows. At first, it's just an unconscious observation. The shadow of your humble dwelling stretches long and distorted, pointing westward as the sun creeps up. As the sun climbs higher, the shadow shrinks, becoming shorter, sharper, drawing closer to the base of the wall. And then, as the sun reaches its zenith, that brief, almost magical moment, the shadow practically vanishes, huddling directly beneath the object that casts it. And finally, as the afternoon wears on and the sun begins its slow descent towards the western desert, the shadow stretches out again, longer and longer, now pointing eastward, reaching out like a silent, elongated finger. This wasn't just a quaint observation for the ancient Egyptians. It was the genesis of their entire system of timekeeping. They didn't need complex gears or intricate mechanisms. They had the sun and they had shadows. It was simple, elegant, and profoundly effective. For a society deeply intertwined with the natural world. Think about it. Every morning, as the sun emerged from the eastern desert, casting those long blue shadows across the dewy fields, you'd begin your work. You'd know that when the shadows grew short and huddled close, it was the hottest part of the day, a time for a brief respite, a moment to seek the shade of a date palm and share some dried figs. And as those shadows began to stretch out again, painting the landscape in hues of orange and purple, you'd know that the day's labor was nearing its end and the cooler, more hospitable evening was approaching. This instinctive understanding of the sun's journey and its resulting shadows formed the bedrock of their early time measurement. It wasn't about precise minutes and seconds. It was about phases of the day marked by the shifting light. This concept, so fundamental, is what historians refer to as mnemonic timekeeping, derived from the Greek word gnomon, which simply means an indicator or the part of a sundial that casts the shadow. Imagine your clock was literally the world around you, the shadow of a particular rock, the edge of a well. Even your own body, each could serve as a rudimentary marker. But to move beyond just a general sense of morning, midday, and afternoon, the Egyptians needed something more consistent, more reliable. They needed a fixed point, a stationary object whose shadow they could observe and record. This is where the concept of the sundial truly begins to emerge. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment. Rather, it was a gradual evolution, a refinement of that innate understanding. Someone, perhaps a particularly observant priest or a skilled craftsman, likely started by simply marking the ground around a vertical stick. As the sun moved, the shadow of the stick would fall upon different marks, creating a rudimentary scale. This was a major leap. Suddenly, you weren't just relying on the general feeling of the day. You had a visual, tangible representation of the sun's progress. You could see, with increasing clarity, the progression of what would eventually become the hours. Now, when we talk about hours in ancient Egypt, don't picture the neat 60-minute segments you're used to. Their hours, particularly in these early stages, were unequal. The length of an hour would change with the seasons. A daytime hour in summer, when the sun was high for longer, would be much longer than a daytime hour in winter. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern-day school kid. Sorry, Johnny, your summer vacation hours are just longer than your winter ones. That's just how the universe works. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation. This fascinating quirk, the unequal hour, is a direct consequence of using the sun's shadow as the primary timekeeper. The daily arc of the sun changes throughout the year, and with it the path and speed of the shadows. It required a keen eye and a deep understanding of the natural world to make sense of it all. This wasn't some abstract concept. It directly impacted their daily lives. The time for the morning meal, the length of a work period in the fields, the timing of religious rituals, all were governed by these fluctuating, shadow-defined hours. It gives you a new appreciation for their adaptability, doesn't it? No wonder they built such magnificent structures. They had to be constantly observing and calculating. The mainstream historical fact here is that the earliest known sundials in Egypt date back to at least the 15th century BCE, during the New Kingdom period. These weren't your garden variety, fancy, decorative pieces. These were practical, functional instruments. They were typically L-shaped or comprised of a horizontal base with a vertical block at one end. The shadow of the block would fall across marks on the horizontal bar, indicating the time. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some of these early sundials were found in workmen's villages, like the one at Deir el-Medina, where the artisans who built the royal tombs lived. It's a little surprising, perhaps, to think of humble laborers using such tools, but it shows just how ingrained this system was in all levels of society. It wasn't just for the priests in their temples. even the guys chipping away at pharaohs. Eternal resting place needed to know when to break for lunch. One has to wonder if there were ever disputes amongst the workers about whose sundial was faster or slower. My shadow says it's lunch. Your shadow says we still have an hour. Is your gnomon leaning, old man? The ancient Egyptian equivalent of my watch is synced to the atomic clock. Yours is still set to daylight savings. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians developed this shadow-based timekeeping system entirely independently, or if there might have been some very early, subtle influences from neighboring cultures. Though the archaeological evidence strongly points to an indigenous development, driven by their unique environment and astronomical observations. But regardless of its exact origin, the elegance and simplicity of measuring time by the sun's shadow laid the foundation for more sophisticated instruments and a deeper understanding of the passage of time itself. You're starting to see, aren't you, how something as simple as a shadow, something we barely notice today, was once the very heartbeat of a civilization. You're still there, feeling the dry heat, squinting at the intense sunlight, having grasped the fundamental concept of shadows as timekeepers. You now witness the ancient Egyptians taking their first tentative steps towards creating actual devices to harness this natural phenomenon. It's no longer just an intuitive understanding. It's about making it tangible, measurable, and repeatable. Imagine the earliest versions of what we would call a sundial. Forget polished brass and intricate engravings. These were born from practicality, from the need to organize daily life beyond simply when the sun feels high. The very first sundials were likely incredibly simple, perhaps nothing more than a stone slab laid flat on the ground, with a vertical stick or a short, stubby pillar firmly planted in its center. As the sun traversed the sky, the shadow cast by this central gnomon would sweep across the surface of the stone. Now, how do you mark the passage of time on this crude device? You simply make marks, perhaps a series of lines carved into the stone, radiating outwards from the base of the gnomon, or maybe just small pebbles placed at regular intervals along the shadow's path. Think of the patience required, day after day, as the sun rose, reached its peak, and then descended. Someone would have to carefully observe where the tip of the shadow fell. They'd note the rising sun, the morning, the peak of the day, and the afternoon. And each day, they'd refine their markings. It wasn't about minutes, remember, but about consistent segments of the day. They were defining their hours by the sun's journey. These early devices weren't portable. They were fixed, often in central locations within villages or at key points along paths. You'd know that when the shadow hit the third mark, it was time to gather your tools for the morning's work. When it touched the central, shortest mark, it was time for that brief, welcome midday break, perhaps under the shade of a sycamore tree. One of the most common forms of these early sundials was the L-shaped sundial, or shadow clock, which emerged during the New Kingdom around 1500 BCE. Picture a flat, horizontal base, almost like a ruler, and at one end a raised vertical block. This block would cast a shadow onto the horizontal strip. The strip itself would be marked with divisions. As the sun rose in the east, the shadow from the vertical block would be long and point west. As the sun climbed, the shadow would shorten and move along the marked scale. At noon, the shadow would be at its shortest, perhaps aligning with a specific mark or even disappearing entirely if the sun was directly overhead and the gnomon was aligned perfectly. As the sun descended in the west, the shadow would lengthen, again moving back along the scale, but this time pointing east. This L-shaped design was particularly ingenious because it was relatively compact and could be oriented with precision. The horizontal arm would typically be aligned east-west. This allowed for a more consistent reading of the time throughout the daylight hours. You'd simply turn the device to face the rising or setting sun, depending on the time of day, and then read the shadow. It sounds simple, but it was a revolutionary step in practical timekeeping. Now, a mainstream historical fact here is that one of the most famous examples of these L-shaped sundials was discovered in ancient Thebes, specifically in the tomb of the royal architect Amenhotep, dating to the reign of Thutmose III. This particular artifact gives us a tangible link to how these devices were actually used. It shows the careful craftsmanship and the importance placed on these tools, even for an architect who would have needed to coordinate his workers and projects with the sun's schedule. And for a quirky tidbit, these L-shaped sundials often had 5 divisions marked on their horizontal bar for the morning and another 5 for the afternoon. Why 5? Well, the Egyptians typically divided their daylight into 10 or 12 hours. But because the very early morning and late evening shadows were less distinct and less reliable for accurate measurement, they often focused on the clearer, more defined parts of the day. It's a bit like deciding not to bother counting the first and last few minutes of a class because everyone's still settling in or packing up. Practical, if not perfectly comprehensive. Historians still argue whether the exact number of divisions was purely pragmatic or if there was some underlying symbolic or astronomical significance to the choice of 5. Beyond simply dividing the easily measurable part of the day into convenient segments, think about the daily routine this created. You, as an ancient Egyptian, might wake up with the sun, as always. But now, you have a more precise way of knowing when to start work. You consult the village sundial. The shadow falls on the second mark. Ah, you think, time to get to the fields before the heat becomes unbearable. As the day progresses, you keep an eye on the shadow. When it hits the middle mark, you know it's time to gather with your fellow workers for that midday meal, perhaps sharing flatbread and a bit of dried fish. You might grumble about the heat, but you know this respite is essential before the afternoon's labor. These sundials weren't just for farmers, though. They were crucial for the priests in their temples, who needed to time rituals and offerings. Precisely. Imagine the chaos if the offerings weren't made at the correct sun-determined hour. The gods might be displeased, and nobody wanted that. So, these simple devices helped maintain cosmic order as much as practical daily routines. The design of these sundials also hinted at a burgeoning understanding of astronomy. While rudimentary, the very act of observing and charting the sun's shadow required an implicit recognition of the sun's consistent path across the sky. They might not have had our modern understanding of the Earth orbiting the sun, but they understood the sun's daily arc and its impact on shadows. The fact that they could even conceive of creating a device to map this natural phenomenon speaks volumes about their observational skills and their burgeoning scientific curiosity. The development of these early sundials wasn't just about telling time, it was about controlling time, in a sense. It moved the power of timekeeping from the abstract, personal perception of daylight to a more standardized, publicly accessible system. Now, everyone in the village could look at the same device and agree on what time it was. This facilitated communal activities, synchronized work efforts, and added a layer of order to what might otherwise have been a more fluid, less regulated existence. It was the ancient equivalent of everyone having the same schedule app on their phone, but instead of a screen, it was a shadow on a stone. Consider the precision, or lack thereof, in these early devices. While they marked hours, these hours were not of uniform length throughout the year. Remember, a daylight hour in the summer was longer than a daylight hour in the winter. This means that if you used an L-shaped sundial, the marks on it wouldn't represent fixed units of time like our hours do. Instead, they represented a fraction of the total daylight, which itself varied. This might seem inefficient to us, but it was perfectly logical for a people whose lives were so closely tied to the cycle of the sun. The length of their workday naturally contracted in winter and expanded in summer, and their timekeeping system reflected this organic rhythm. This fluidity also suggests a different perception of time itself. For us, time is a rigid, unyielding progression of seconds, minutes, and hours. For the ancient Egyptians, especially in these early periods, time was perhaps more cyclical and relative to the sun's presence. It was about the segments of light, rather than fixed, absolute units. This highlights how our understanding and experience of time are heavily influenced by the technology we use to measure it. Without a mechanical clock, the concept of a fixed hour simply didn't exist in the same way. The L-shaped sundials were also quite portable, at least some of the smaller ones. Imagine a high-ranking official or a wealthy merchant traveling along the Nile. Instead of relying on guesswork or local fixed sundials, they could carry their own personal timekeeper. They could simply set their sundial down, align it correctly with the sun, and know the time. This gave them a degree of autonomy and control over their schedules. That would have been unimaginable just a few centuries earlier. It was like having the first wearable tech, but instead of telling you your heart rate, it told you when it was time for your chariot to depart. These devices, though simple in their construction, represented a significant intellectual leap. They demonstrated an ability to observe, categorize, and quantify a natural phenomenon. They were the first steps on a long journey that would eventually lead to the complex chronometers and atomic clocks we have today. And all of it, every single tick and tock, began with the humble shadow of a stick on a stone. You're still immersed in that ancient Egyptian world. The sun relentless, the air dry and warm against your skin. You've seen how they started to mark shadows, how the L-shaped sundials took form. But at the heart of it all, the absolute cornerstone of their shadow-based timekeeping was something incredibly simple, yet profoundly important: the gnomon. This isn't some complex piece of machinery, it's just the part of a sundial that casts the shadow. In its purest form, it was nothing more than a vertical stick or a small, upright pillar. Imagine yourself as one of the very first Egyptians to truly grasp its significance. You're not an astronomer, not a priest, just someone tending to your daily life. You plant a straight stick into the soft earth near your dwelling, perhaps to mark a boundary or just out of idle curiosity. As the sun begins its steady climb from the eastern horizon, you notice the stick's shadow stretching long across the ground, pointing westward, almost like a giant, slow-moving hand. You pause your work, captivated. As the sun rises higher, that shadow begins to shrink, drawing closer and closer to the base of the stick. And then, for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, when the sun is at its absolute highest point, the shadow becomes incredibly short, sometimes even disappearing completely if the sun is directly overhead. This, you realize, is midday. This is when the sun rules supreme. Then, as the afternoon wears on, the shadow begins to lengthen again. But this time it points eastward, slowly creeping across the dust, growing longer and longer until the sun dips below the western horizon and darkness finally reclaims the land. This daily cycle, observed through the simple gnomon, was the most fundamental clock they possessed. The length of the shadow indicated how high the sun was in the sky, and thus how far along the day had progressed. The direction of the shadow told you whether it was morning, midday, or afternoon. It was intuitive, reliable, and required no moving parts, no delicate mechanisms that could break in the harsh desert environment. The beauty of the gnomon was its universality. Any upright object could serve as one: a standing person, a palm tree, even a well-placed rock could cast a shadow that, with careful observation, could tell you the approximate time. This inherent simplicity meant that timekeeping wasn't restricted to a privileged few. It was a phenomenon accessible to everyone. Of course, official timekeeping involved more carefully crafted gnomons and marked surfaces, but the principle remained the same. It's like how you can tell time on your phone, but you can also generally guess the time just by looking at the light outside, right? The gnomon was that light, quantified. Now, a mainstream historical fact that underscores the importance of the gnomon. Some of the earliest gnomons were simply obelisks. These towering stone pillars, which we'll delve into more deeply later, weren't just monumental architectural statements or symbols of connection to the gods. They were also vast, public sundials. Their immense shadows swept across temple courtyards and city squares, making the passage of time visible to entire populations. Imagine the grand scale of such a clock. Your entire city square is the face of the clock, and the massive obelisk is the central hand. It's a slightly less subtle way of saying it's time for tea, wouldn't you say? For a quirky tidbit, it's worth noting that the gnomon's shadow isn't always perfectly straight, due to the sun's apparent movement and the curvature of the earth. The tip of a gnomon's shadow traces a hyperbolic curve on a flat surface throughout the day. The Egyptians might not have understood the complex geometry behind this, but they certainly observed it. This meant that their early, simple gnomons and straight-line markings would have had inherent inaccuracies, especially at different times of the year. It required a lot of trial and error, a lot of recalibration, to make these devices truly useful. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians had an intuitive grasp of this complex path of the shadow, or if their system was more of a practical approximation that was good enough for their daily needs. It's a bit like driving a car without a speedometer, but still knowing roughly how fast you're going based on the wind and engine noise. The gnomon's simplicity also meant it was susceptible to certain environmental factors. Cloud cover, obviously, rendered it useless. But even on clear days, factors like atmospheric refraction, the bending of light as it passes through different air densities, could subtly alter the shadow's path, especially near the horizon. For the Egyptians, these weren't errors to be corrected by scientific instruments. They were simply part of the sun's natural variability. You learned to account for it, perhaps by instinct, or by referring to a more robust, temple-based timekeeper. If crucial timing was required, the concept of the gnomon also forced an early understanding of direction. To accurately read a gnomon's shadow, you needed a consistent orientation. You had to know where east was, where west was, and where true north was. The Egyptians, with their reliance on the predictable flooding of the Nile and the consistent rise of the sun, were expert navigators by the stars and the sun. This innate directional awareness was crucial for setting up their gnomons correctly. If your gnomon wasn't perfectly vertical, or your base wasn't perfectly aligned, your time would be off, perhaps leading to missed appointments or, worse, poorly timed rituals. Imagine trying to explain to a pharaoh that the morning offering was late because your gnomon was leaning. Not a conversation you'd want to have. The gnomon's shadow wasn't just about telling the hour of the day. Its length at midday also gave a strong indication of the season. In summer, when the sun was high, the midday shadow would be very short. In winter, when the sun was lower in the sky, the midday shadow would be significantly longer. This allowed them to track the progression of the year, vital for agricultural cycles like planting and harvesting, and for predicting the crucial annual flooding of the Nile. So, this single, simple stick was effectively a daily clock and a seasonal calendar rolled into one. It was the ultimate multi-tool of the ancient world. The reliance on the gnomon fostered a deep connection between the Egyptian people and the natural world. Their lives weren't segmented by arbitrary numbers, but by the observable, undeniable movements of the sun. You lived by the sun's energy, and you measured your day by its shadow. This created a rhythm of life that was perhaps more attuned to nature's cycles than our own fast-paced, clock-driven existence. There was no concept of running late in the same way, at least not in terms of precise minutes. You were late if the sun had clearly moved beyond the expected shadow mark. The precise construction of these gnomons, even in their early forms, reveals a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of geometry. While they may not have had the mathematical notation we use today, they understood how to create a true vertical, how to lay out a straight line, and how to make consistent divisions. These were practical engineers and observers, applying their insights directly to the challenge of tracking time. They weren't theorizing in ivory towers. They were building functional tools from the ground up, quite literally. The gnomon was also a constant reminder of the sun god Ra's omnipresence and power. As Ra traversed the heavens, his journey was visibly marked by the gnomon's shadow on earth. This intertwined the practical act of timekeeping with profound religious and cosmological beliefs. Every glance at a shadow wasn't just about knowing the time for work. It was a subtle affirmation of the divine order, a daily connection to the most powerful deity in their pantheon. It turns a simple stick into something almost sacred, doesn't it? So, while we might marvel at the complexity of later water clocks or the astronomical precision of their star calendars, it all began with the simple, silent power of the gnomon. It was the first, most intuitive way to harness the sun's immense energy to bring order to human lives, transforming the abstract concept of time into a tangible, observable reality. And as you watch that shadow creep across the dusty ground, you feel that ancient connection yourself, a deep appreciation for the ingenuity born from necessity. Asterisk, you're still standing there, feeling the sun's warmth, but now your eyes are sharper, more attuned to the subtle shifts around you. You've understood the gnomon, that simple, upright stick, and its fundamental role. Now, you're watching the shadow itself, observing its intricate, predictable dance across the Egyptian landscape, a ballet choreographed by the sun. This daily performance was the very essence of their timekeeping, a constant, visual cue that shaped every aspect of their existence. Imagine the sun beginning its climb. You watch as the shadow of a temple column, a palm tree, or even your own body stretches long and distorted towards the west. It's thin, ethereal, and seems to glide silently, almost imperceptibly, over the dusty ground. This is morning. The air is still relatively cool. A faint breeze might stir the papyrus reeds along the Nile, and the world is awakening. The shadow moves relatively quickly at this time, covering more ground in what we might consider an hour than it will later. In the day, this isn't because the sun is moving faster, but because of the geometry of the sun's low angle. Think of holding a flashlight close to a wall. The beam spreads out, and a small movement of the flashlight causes a large movement of the light patch. The sun, in the early morning, acts similarly. As the sun ascends higher, its rays becoming more direct, the shadow begins to contract. It shortens, thickens, and moves with a slower, more deliberate pace. The colors in the landscape become sharper, more defined under the intense light. This is the mid-morning, a period of increasing heat and activity. You see workers in the fields, their own shadows becoming stubbier as they toil. The shadow of the gnomon on a sundial moves steadily, crossing the marked lines with increasing precision. Then comes the most pivotal moment of the day for shadow timekeeping, midday or solar noon. The sun stands at its highest point in the sky, directly overhead, or very nearly so, and the shadow, it's at its absolute shortest. For a brief period, if the gnomon is perfectly vertical and the sun is directly overhead, the shadow can even appear to vanish entirely, receding into the base of the object that casts it. This is the zenith of the day, the time of maximum heat and light. For the ancient Egyptians, this was a moment of pause, a natural break in the relentless rhythm of work. It was too hot to labor effectively, so people sought shelter, perhaps, in their homes or beneath specially constructed awnings. You might sit with your family, share a simple meal, and escape the sun's fierce embrace. It was the world's most effective lunch break reminder, completely heat-activated. As the sun begins its descent towards the western horizon, the shadow's dance reverses. It starts to lengthen again, stretching out towards the east, growing longer and longer, its edges softening, blurring as the light begins to mellow. This is the afternoon. The heat begins to recede, slowly, allowing for renewed activity. The shadow's movement once again picks up speed as the sun dips lower, mirroring its rapid movement in the morning. The sky transforms, shifting from a brilliant blue to softer hues of orange, pink, and finally, deep purple as the sun approaches the horizon. This constant, observable motion of the shadow was the ancient Egyptians' most reliable clock. It wasn't just about telling time. It was about feeling time, experiencing its passage through the subtle changes in light and shadow. Imagine how attuned you would become to these shifts if they were your only way of tracking the day. You'd instinctively know the time of day just by the angle of the sun, the length of the shadows on the ground, or the quality of the light filtering into your home. A mainstream historical fact reinforcing this: the ancient Egyptians developed a system of 12 daytime hours and 12 nighttime hours. However, as you remember, these hours were unequal in length. They were proportional to the length of daylight and darkness on any given day. So, a daytime hour in summer was longer than a daytime hour in winter, and vice versa for nighttime. Hours. This is a crucial distinction from our modern fixed-length hours. This unequal system worked perfectly for an agrarian society deeply tied to solar cycles. You simply worked when the sun provided sufficient light, and rested when it didn't. Now, for a quirky tidbit, because the shadows move slowest around midday and fastest near sunrise and sunset, ancient Egyptian sundials often had their hour marks closer together near the middle of the day and spaced further apart at the ends. This accounted for the varying speed of the shadow's apparent movement. It shows a sophisticated, empirical understanding of light and shadow, even without advanced mathematical formulas. They just observed, noted, and adapted. Imagine the endless iterations of people trying to mark those lines perfectly. No, Imhotep. The shadow moves faster here. See, it's a testament to their patience and observational skills. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians adjusted for the varying speed of the shadow solely through empirical observation and adjustment, or if they had some nascent geometrical understanding of the hyperbolic path that the tip of a shadow traces over the course of a day on a flat surface. The daily dance of the shadow wasn't always perfectly consistent, even for the same time of day. Factors like weather, particularly dust storms or heavy cloud cover, could obscure the sun, rendering shadow-based timekeeping impossible. On such days, life would have slowed, relying more on internal rhythms and less precise estimations. This is perhaps where other forms of timekeeping, like the very early use of water clocks, began to gain importance for more critical tasks, though they were far less common than sundials. Think about the impact this had on social life. Meetings, markets, religious festivals, all would have been timed by the sun's position. When a decree was announced, it might be for after the midday shadow has passed the third mark. This common understanding of time, visible to everyone, would have fostered a shared rhythm of life. There was no need for everyone to own a personal time-measuring device. The sun was everyone's universal clock, with the gnomon acting as the public display. The shadow's journey also provided a constant visual reminder of impermanence. Each day, the shadow appeared, moved, and then vanished with the setting sun, only to reappear the next morning. It was a subtle, daily lesson in the ephemeral nature of existence, tying the practical measurement of time to deeper philosophical and religious concepts. For a people so focused on the afterlife and the cyclical nature of rebirth, the daily death and resurrection of the sun, mirrored in its shadow, would have held profound significance. The observation of the shadow's dance also laid the groundwork for more advanced astronomical understanding. By noting the precise point where the shadow was shortest each day, solar noon, and how that point shifted north and south over the year, the Egyptians began to map the sun's apparent path more accurately. This was crucial for developing their calendar, which was vital for predicting the Nile's annual inundation, the lifeblood of their civilization. So, the humble shadow wasn't just for telling the time of day. It was key to predicting the very cycles that sustained their entire society. Consider the skill required to accurately read these shadows. It wasn't just a matter of glancing at a dial. You had to account for the season, the time of year, and perhaps even the specific location of the gnomon. A shadow at a certain length might mean one time in summer and another in winter. It required an educated eye, a deep, practical knowledge passed down through generations. It was a craft, not just a simple act. Imagine an apprentice learning to read the sun. He'd spend hours observing, comparing, internalizing the subtle nuances of light and shade. The daily passage of the shadow wasn't just a scientific or practical observation. It was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. The sun god Ra's journey across the sky was literally made manifest in the gnomon's shadow. As Ra sailed his boat across the heavens, his presence on earth was marked by the shifting light. The shadow was a tangible connection between the divine and the mundane, a constant, silent testament to the power of the gods. Ultimately, the daily dance of the shadow was more than just a method of timekeeping for the ancient Egyptians. It was a fundamental aspect of their relationship with the cosmos. a practical tool, a spiritual guide, and a constant beautiful reminder of the rhythms of life dictated by the celestial bodies above. And as you watch that shadow stretch and contract, you feel a connection to those ancient observers, understanding their world through the movement of light and dark. You're still there, feeling the omnipresent sun, observing the ballet of shadows. But now, as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, you start to notice something else, something even more profound about the shadow's behavior, its seasonal shifts, the daily dance you've become accustomed to. The predictable shrinking and lengthening isn't identical every day of the year. No, the shadow itself has a rhythm, a grander cycle that reflects the sun's changing position in the sky throughout the year. Imagine that gnomon, that simple upright stick planted firmly in the ground. As you observe it day after day, you notice that the shortest shadow it casts at midday isn't always the same length. In the scorching heat of summer, when the sun climbs highest in the sky, almost directly overhead, the midday shadow is remarkably short, sometimes barely visible. It huddles close to the base of the gnomon, almost as if shrinking from the intense light. This is when the sun's rays are most direct, hitting the earth at a steep angle. But then, as the days gradually shorten and the air begins to carry a hint of coolness, signaling the approach of winter, you observe a distinct change. The midday shadow starts to lengthen. It stretches out further, even at the sun's highest point, indicating that the sun is now lower in the sky, its rays striking the earth at a more oblique angle. This seasonal variation in the midday shadow's length was a crucial piece of the ancient Egyptians' understanding of their world. It was their natural barometer for the progression of the year, far more reliable than the fleeting changes in temperature. This phenomenon, the changing length of the midday shadow, is a direct consequence of the Earth's axial tilt relative to its orbit around the Sun. While the Egyptians didn't understand orbital mechanics in the way we do today, they were astute, empirical observers. They noticed that the Sun's apparent path across the sky shifted throughout the year. In summer, it rose further north and set further north. In winter, it rose and set further south. This change in the sun's daily arc directly influenced the angle at which its light hit the gnomon, thus altering the shadow's length and direction. It's like watching a giant, cosmic light show, with the sun as the spotlight and the earth as the stage. And the gnome, that's your personal, ever-reliable shadow puppet. A mainstream historical fact here is that the ancient Egyptians, through these meticulous observations of the sun's changing path and the associated shadow lengths, were able to develop a highly accurate civil calendar of 365 days. This calendar, with its 3 seasons of 4 months each, inundation, growth, and harvest, was remarkably consistent and crucial for managing their agricultural society, particularly for predicting the annual Nile flood. The seasonal shift in shadows was a key indicator, a natural signal for when the life-giving waters were due. Now, for a quirky tidbit to precisely track these seasonal changes, some Egyptian sundials, especially the more sophisticated ones, incorporated slightly curved lines or multiple sets of marks to account for the sun's varying path. Instead of just one set of hourly divisions, they might have several, one for the summer solstice, one for the winter solstice, and perhaps one for the equinoxes. This meant that reading the time wasn't just about finding the shadow, but also knowing which set of lines to use based on the time of year. Imagine the confusion if you used the winter marks in summer. You'd be perpetually early or late, depending on which direction you read it. It's a bit like having different time zones within the same city, just based on the season. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these multi-marked sundials indicates a nascent understanding of celestial mechanics, or if it was purely the result of centuries of pragmatic observation and empirical adjustment, simply noting this mark works for this season. The direction of the shadow at specific times of the day also shifted seasonally. At sunrise and sunset, the shadow's pointing direction would vary more significantly than around midday. This was another cue for the Egyptians, further solidifying their understanding of the sun's changing celestial journey. You could tell not just the time of day, but also roughly the time of year, just by observing the shadows. This was a profound level of environmental literacy. Think about the importance of this seasonal shadow shift for agricultural planning. As a farmer, you'd know that when the midday shadow reached a certain length, it was time to prepare the fields for planting after the receding floodwaters. When it was at its shortest, you knew the height of summer was upon you, and it was time for careful water management and perhaps seeking shade during the hottest parts of the day. The shadow was an agricultural clock, a cosmic planner that guided their entire food supply. This deep connection between the sun's journey, the shadows it cast, and the agricultural cycle meant that the Egyptian calendar wasn't an abstract concept. It was lived experience, etched onto the very landscape by the sun's light. Their year was intrinsically linked to the solar year, a testament to their sophisticated observational astronomy. Without telescopes or complex instruments, they achieved remarkable accuracy simply by observing the most obvious astronomical phenomena. The seasonal changes in shadow also influenced religious festivals and ceremonies. Many of these were tied to specific points in the solar year, such as the solstices and equinoxes, which were marked by the extreme lengths of the midday shadow or the equal lengths of day and night. The priests, acting as the primary timekeepers and astronomers, would meticulously observe the shadows cast by the temple obelisks or monumental sundials to declare the precise moments for these sacred events. Imagine the solemnity as the entire community awaited the exact alignment of a shadow on a sacred mark, signaling a moment of divine significance. The development of the 365-day calendar, directly informed by these seasonal shadow shifts, allowed for a level of social organization and planning previously impossible. It enabled large-scale construction projects, the coordination of labor, and the efficient management of resources. Without this predictable calendar, based on the sun's observable movements, their complex civilization simply could not have flourished to the extent that it did. It was the original project management software, all powered by sunlight. This also highlights the Egyptians' pragmatic approach to knowledge. They weren't just observing for intellectual curiosity. They were observing to survive and thrive. The sun provided light, warmth, and time, the fundamental ingredients for life in their desert environment, and by understanding its subtle movements, they unlocked the secrets to managing their world. The shadows were not just indicators, they were teachers. The ability to discern the season from a shadow's length also meant that people could adjust their daily schedules accordingly. Workdays would naturally be longer in summer and shorter in winter, not because someone decided on a fixed schedule, but because the sun itself dictated the available light. This flexible approach to the hour, where its length varied with the season, suggests a society that was less rigidly bound by abstract units of time and more by the natural flow of the environment. So, as you continue to watch that note, you're not just seeing the passage of a single day, but the slow, majestic progression of the entire year. The shadow, once a simple marker of the hour, now reveals the grander cycles of the seasons, connecting the immediate present to the long, unfolding rhythm of the Earth's journey around the sun. It's a reminder that even the simplest observation, when done with persistence and keenness, can reveal the profound underlying you're still fixed in that ancient Egyptian scene. The sun above, the gnomon below, its shadow now a familiar, silent companion. You've grasped its daily dance, understood its seasonal fluctuations. Now you're ready to delve deeper into the art of decoding the sun's work, moving beyond simple observation to understanding how the ancient Egyptians systematically interpreted the shadow's length and direction to truly tell time. This wasn't just guesswork. It was a refined skill, a practical science born from centuries of observation. Imagine holding one of those L-shaped sundials, perhaps a small portable one made of wood or stone. It has a horizontal arm marked with lines and a vertical block at one end that casts the shadow. To use it, you first have to orient it correctly. The vertical block, the gnomon, needed to point in a specific direction, usually towards true north or south, depending on the design and the time of year. For the Egyptians, who relied heavily on the predictable rising of the sun in the east and setting in the west, and the steady northern flow of the Nile, orientation was almost instinctive. They would likely align the horizontal bar along an east-west axis. Once aligned, the key was observing where the tip of the shadow fell on the marked scale. In the morning, with the sun low in the east, the shadow would be long, falling near the western end of the scale. As the sun climbed, the shadow would shorten, moving progressively along the marks towards the gnomon. At midday, it would be at its shortest, perhaps aligning with a central mark. Then, in the afternoon, as the sun descended, the shadow would lengthen again, moving back along the scale towards the eastern end. The challenge, as you now know, was the unequal hours. Since the length of daylight varied with the seasons, the hours marked on the sundial also varied in length. So, a mark on the sundial didn't represent a fixed 60-minute period like our hours do. Instead, it represented a division of the current daylight period into a set number of segments, often 10 or 12 for the visible daytime. This meant that the marks on the sundial couldn't be equally spaced if they were to accurately represent equal fractions of the day. They had to be adjusted, a mainstream historical fact, to account for this. The more sophisticated Egyptian sundials sometimes had multiple scales or a system of curved lines. For instance, a sundial might have 3 distinct lines for the hours, one for summer, one for winter, and one for the equinoxes spring and autumn. You would have to know which season it was to use the correct set of lines. This indicates a very practical, empirical approach to design, rooted in continuous observation rather than abstract mathematical principles. It's like having 3 different instruction manuals for the same device, depending on the time of year. A bit clunky, perhaps, but effective. Now, for a quirky tidbit. The earliest known Egyptian sundials, besides the L-shaped ones, also included what are sometimes called shadow clocks with an elevated crossbar. These devices often had 2 inclined planes, and the shadow of the crossbar would fall on these planes, with different marks for different seasons. The orientation and design were specifically chosen to optimize the readability of the shadow at various times of the day and year. It's almost as if they were trying to invent the modern digital clock, but with only sunlight and stone. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians possessed a true theoretical understanding of the spherical geometry that dictates the sun's path and shadow behavior, or if their impressive accuracy was purely the result of meticulous, empirical observation and pragmatic trial and error adjustments. The process of calibration would have been crucial. Imagine setting up a new sundial. You wouldn't just guess where the marks go. You'd observe it over an entire year, marking where the shadow falls at specific, repeatable moments: sunrise, midday, and sunset, and intermediate points that divide the visible daylight into segments. And you'd do this repeatedly, probably using a consistent reference point. Perhaps a priest's observation of a specific star at dawn, or a known ritual time. This continuous recalibration ensured accuracy, or at least consistency, within their system. Consider the role of the priests in this process. While many ordinary Egyptians would have had an intuitive sense of the time, the precise decoding of the sun's journey, especially for religious ceremonies and administrative tasks, fell to the priestly class. They were the astronomers, the keepers of the calendar, and the guardians of time. They would observe the great temple obelisks or specialized sundials with meticulous care, their readings dictating the timing of offerings, festivals, and even royal decrees. Their ability to read the sun's art was a source of great power. An authority. The shadow wasn't just a simple line. Its clarity and distinctness also played a role. On a perfectly clear, cloudless day, the shadow would be sharp and well-defined, making it easy to read. But in the hazy light of a dust storm, or when the air was thick with humidity less common, but not impossible, the shadow might be diffuse and harder to interpret precisely. This inherent variability meant that the system wasn't always perfectly precise, but it was robust enough for their needs. You learn to live with a bit of fuzziness around the edges of your clock, especially when it's powered by a giant ball of fire millions of miles away. The concept of hours themselves was also fluid. While they divided the day into equal parts of daylight, for example, 10 or 12, the length of these parts changed. This meant that if you said, "I'll meet you in 2 hours," that meant 2 of today's hours, which would be a different absolute duration depending on whether it was summer or winter. It required a mental flexibility that we, with our rigidly defined 60-minute hours, might find challenging. It's like everyone agreeing that a cup is a measure, but the size of the cup changes daily. This system of decoding the sun's art also allowed them to track specific astronomical events. The solstices, for example, were marked by the longest and shortest midday shadows, indicating the sun's furthest points north and south. The equinoxes, when day and night were roughly equal in length, would also have specific shadow characteristics. These were crucial moments, deeply embedded in their religious and agricultural calendars. The very act of decoding the sun's art required a level of public trust in the system. When the priest announced the time for a ritual, or a supervisor declared it was time to change tasks, everyone had to trust that the sundial was being read correctly. This shared understanding reinforced social cohesion and allowed for complex, coordinated activities, from building pyramids to managing vast irrigation systems. The sundial was a public declaration of time, visible for all to see and interpret. Guided by the experts, the Egyptians' mastery of shadow decoding, despite its reliance on empirical observation over abstract theory, demonstrates an extraordinary ingenuity. They used the most fundamental observable phenomenon, light and shadow, to bring order and predictability to their world. They took what nature offered and fashioned it into a practical, powerful tool. And as you continue to watch that shadow creep across the ancient marks, you gain a deep appreciation for the silent, yet profound, language of the sun. It's speaking to you, even now, telling you the story of time, you're still there, feeling the ancient sun on your skin, the dust under your feet. You've seen the humble no-man, understood the daily and seasonal dance of its shadow, and even begun to grasp the art of decoding its meaning. Now, you're about to witness the ultimate expression of this knowledge, a monumental testament to the Egyptians' ingenuity. Obelisks as grand clocks. These towering stone structures weren't just impressive architectural feats or symbols of divine power. They were also the largest, most visible sundials ever conceived, integrating timekeeping into the very fabric of their monumental landscape. Imagine standing in the vast, sun-drenched courtyard of a great temple like Karnak or Luxor. Before you rises a colossal obelisk, carved from a single piece of red granite, its tip piercing the impossibly blue sky. Its sheer scale is awe-inspiring. But as the sun arcs overhead, you notice something else: the massive, elongated shadow it casts. This isn't just any shadow. This is the hand of a truly gargantuan clock, sweeping majestically across the paved ground of the temple complex. The obelisk, in essence, was the ultimate gnomon. Its immense height meant it cast a long, clear shadow that was visible from a great distance, making it a public timekeeper for an entire city or temple precinct. The ground around its base often served as the dial of this immense sundial. While archaeological evidence for detailed markings around every obelisk isn't always perfectly preserved, it's clear that the priests and astronomers would have observed and perhaps even marked the progress of these shadows. Think about the scale. A typical obelisk might stand dozens of meters high, casting a shadow that could stretch hundreds of meters. As the sun rose, the obelisk's shadow would stretch westward, touching various architectural features, perhaps a specific column or the edge of a sacred pool. As the sun climbed towards its zenith, the shadow would shorten, drawing closer to the obelisk's base. At midday, it would be at its shortest, sometimes appearing to vanish directly beneath the towering monument. And in the afternoon, it would stretch eastward, growing longer and longer until it finally merged with the growing twilight. Manstream. Historical fact here is that one of the most famous examples of an obelisk specifically used as a sundial is the Lateran obelisk in Rome. While it's in Rome today, it was originally brought from the Temple of Ammon at Karnak in Egypt by Emperor Constantius II. Historical accounts suggest that in ancient Rome, it was indeed used as the gnomon of a vast solar clock in the Circus Maximus, underscoring its long-standing function as a public timekeeper, even outside of Egypt, while its Roman use is better documented. It points to the underlying Egyptian practice. Now, for a quirky tidbit, to make these colossal clocks even more precise, sometimes other structures were built in conjunction with the obelisk. Imagine a series of small, precisely placed markers, or even other, smaller pillars, acting as supplementary indicators for the obelisk's shadow. These would help define hours or specific times more accurately, particularly as the shadows moved across less marked open spaces. It's like having little minute hands sprinkled around your giant hour hand. Historians still argue whether these obelisk clocks were primarily for practical daily timekeeping for the populace, or more symbolic and ceremonial, used by priests to mark the precise timing of rituals and astronomical events. It's a question of whether it was a public utility or a sacred instrument. The construction of these obelisk clocks required an astonishing level of engineering skill. Not only did they have to quarry, transport, and erect these monolithic stones, a feat of incredible human effort, but they also had to align them with remarkable precision. The base of the obelisk needed to be perfectly level, and the obelisk itself had to be perfectly vertical. Any lean or tilt would throw off the accuracy of the shadow. This wasn't just brute force. It was a blend of meticulous planning, skilled craftsmanship, and an innate understanding of geometry and astronomy. You can almost hear the foreman yelling, "No, not quite plumb. Another quarter-inch to the west." The obelisk, as a clock, was also deeply intertwined with religious significance. These monuments were dedicated to the sun god Ra, symbolizing his divine power and his daily journey across the heavens. As the obelisk's shadow moved, it was literally Ra's presence, his watchful eye, traversing the earthly realm. The priests would use these grand clocks to determine the precise moment for offerings, prayers, and festivals that honored the sun god and other deities. The entire temple complex became a sacred space where the divine rhythm of time was made manifest. The concept of such a monumental public clock also speaks to the social order of ancient Egypt. When a major festival was announced, timed by the shadow of the great obelisk, everyone in the city would know the time. It fostered a shared sense of time, a communal rhythm that synchronized the activities of thousands of people. There was no argument about who was right. The massive shadow was the undeniable authority. It was the ultimate, unchallengeable town crier. The seasonal variations we discussed earlier would also be evident in the obelisk's shadow. At the summer solstice, the shadow would be shortest at midday, perhaps barely extending beyond the obelisk's base. At the winter solstice, it would stretch significantly longer. These extreme shadow lengths would have served as clear, unambiguous markers for the change of seasons, providing a reliable signal for agricultural planning and the timing of the Nile flood. The obelisk was not just a daily clock, but also a giant annual calendar. The very act of observing these obelisk shadows also deepened their astronomical knowledge. By meticulously tracking the shadow's path and length throughout the year, the Egyptians could refine their understanding of the sun's apparent movement, helping them to develop their incredibly accurate 365-day calendar. The obelisk was a living laboratory, a massive research instrument recording the celestial dance. Consider the permanence of these stone clocks. Unlike fragile water clocks or smaller, portable sundials that could be damaged or lost, obelisks were built to last for millennia. They were enduring symbols of time itself, marking its relentless, unyielding progress through generations, dynasties, and entire epochs. They stood as a constant reminder that time, like the sun, was eternal and powerful. The shadow of an obelisk would also have been used for more specific architectural and engineering purposes. For example, knowing the precise time of midday, marked by the shortest shadow, would have been crucial for orienting temples and other structures towards cardinal directions or specific celestial alignments. The sun, via its shadow, was their ultimate compass and set square. It was the original CAD software, powered by RA.so. When you think of an ancient Egyptian obelisk, don't just see a beautiful, monumental sculpture. See a sophisticated, colossal time-measuring instrument. See the largest clock the ancient world knew, a device that not only tracked the sun's journey, but also connected the earthly realm to the divine, providing a shared rhythm for an entire civilization. The obelisk, with its grand, silent shadow, truly was a masterpiece of ancient engineering and timekeeping. You're still standing in that ancient Egyptian temple courtyard, the colossal obelisk casting its monumental shadow. You've come to understand that these weren't just grand timekeepers for the general populace. Their integration into the very heart of religious life meant they played a crucial role in temple timekeeping rhythms. Here, within the sacred precincts, the precision of time was paramount, dictating rituals, offerings, and the very flow of divine service. Imagine the dawn breaking over the temple. The first faint blush of light touches the top of the obelisk, and its shadow begins to stretch across the eastern courtyard. This isn't just a random shift, it signals the start of the daily cycle of worship. The priests, the guardians of the divine order, would be meticulously observing these first rays, the first discernible movements of the obelisk's shadow. Their lives were meticulously scheduled, not by the chime of bells, but by the silent, majestic sweep of the sun's influence. Each temple would have its own specific practices, but a common rhythm would have emerged. Certain rituals had to be performed at sunrise, others at mid-morning, at noon, in the afternoon, and at sunset. These precise timings were not arbitrary. They were believed to be critical for maintaining the favor of the gods, for ensuring the cosmic balance of Mat, and for the well-being of Egypt itself. A missed offering, a poorly timed prayer, could have dire consequences. Or so it was believed. The obelisk, or a dedicated, smaller sundial within the temple complex, would serve as the ultimate authority for these timings. The priests would become adept at reading the shadow, not just for its general length or direction, but for its precise position relative to specific marks on the temple pavement, or even to the alignment with other architectural features like doorways or altars. When the shadow of the great obelisk touched a particular sacred stone, or when the light hit a certain statue in a specific way, it would be the signal for a procession to begin, an offering to be made, or a hymn to be sung, a mainstream historical fact. The Temple of Karnak, one of the largest ancient religious sites in the world, contains numerous obelisks and is known to have been a major center for astronomical observation and timekeeping. The alignment of its various structures with celestial events, particularly the solstices, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the sun's path, further reinforcing the idea that these temples were not just places of worship, but also functioning observatories and time measurement centers. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some temple walls and pavements might have had specific carved lines or symbols, almost like a giant, inlaid clock face, upon which the obelisk's shadow would fall. These weren't always simple straight lines, but sometimes complex curves designed to account for the sun's seasonal variations, ensuring that a specific ritual could be performed at the same hour, regardless of whether it was summer or winter. It's a bit like having an elaborate dance floor, where the steps change slightly with the music, but you're still expected to hit every mark. Historians still argue whether the precise alignments of certain temple elements were primarily for symbolic or ritualistic purposes, or if their function as precise time markers was equally, if not more, important in daily temple operations. It's a debate about aesthetics versus utility. The priests, particularly the hour watchers or Ayan Mutef priests, were responsible for maintaining and interpreting these temple clocks. They were the elite astronomers and chronologists of their time. Their duties extended beyond simply reading shadows. They would also have been responsible for calibrating the sundials, perhaps by observing specific stars at night, or by cross-referencing with other timekeeping methods. This wasn't a job for just anyone. It required immense dedication, a keen eye, and a deep understanding of the cosmos. Imagine the pressure. If you're a priest and you misread the shadow, causing a crucial offering to the sun god Ra to be late, what then? Would the crops fail? Would the Nile not flood? The stakes were incredibly high. This responsibility likely led to a culture of meticulous observation and precise record-keeping, even if those records were largely in the form of empirical observations and mental calculations rather than written formulas. The integration of timekeeping into the very architecture of the temple also served to impress upon the common people the power and order of the gods. When they saw the immense shadow of the obelisk sweeping across the sacred space, marking the moments for solemn rituals, it reinforced the idea that the divine presence was active and engaged in the world, its rhythms made manifest for all to see. It was a constant, grand-scale lesson in cosmic order. The temples were not just centers of worship, but also major economic and administrative hubs. Goods were stored, resources managed, and labor organized within their precincts. Precise timekeeping, facilitated by these temple clocks, would have been essential for efficient operation. Knowing when certain deliveries were due, when work shifts ended, or when market activities were at their peak, all relied on a shared understanding of time derived from these grand sundials. It was the original temple management system, powered by sunlight and sacred stone. The rituals themselves often involved specific movements, offerings, and incantations that were synchronized with the sun's position. For instance, the opening of the temple doors to greet the rising sun, the morning purification rituals, the midday offerings to the seated cult statue, and the closing of the doors as the sun set. Each was a precisely timed event. The shadow of the obelisk or the smaller temple sundial provided the exact cue for these sacred actions. The importance of this precision even extended to the timing of the pharaoh's activities. As the living embodiment of the gods, the pharaoh's public appearances, ceremonial duties, and even private prayers might have been scheduled with reference to the temple's timekeeping. The royal schedule was, in essence, aligned with the divine clock. The temple's role as a timekeeping center also speaks to the Egyptian understanding of cycles: the daily cycle of the sun, the monthly cycle of the moon, and the annual cycle of the seasons and the Nile flood. All these cycles were observed, recorded, and interpreted within the sacred precincts, and the obelisk clocks were fundamental to this understanding. They were instruments of cosmic harmony, aligning human activity with the grand design of the universe. So, as you watch that immense shadow move, consider not just the technical marvel of the obelisk as a sundial, but its profound significance. Within the temple, it wasn't just a clock. It was a sacred instrument, dictating the very pulse of religious life, connecting the earthly realm with the divine, and ensuring that time flowed in perfect harmony with the cosmic order envisioned by the ancient Egyptians. It's a silent, powerful testament to how deeply interwoven their science, religion, and daily life truly were. You're still observing the intricacies of time in ancient Egypt, the sun blazing overhead, its shadow defining the hours. You've seen the grand obelisks marking time in temple courtyards. But now you shift your gaze from the dry, sun-baked land to the lifeblood of Egypt itself, the Nile River. You're about to discover how even the rhythmic, predictable flooding of this mighty river subtly intertwined with and influenced the ancient Egyptians' perception and measurement of time. Imagine the annual cycle, the intense summer heat, the low water levels of the Nile, and then, around what we would consider late summer, the dramatic, life-giving inundation. The river swells, overflowing its banks, depositing rich, fertile silt across the floodplain. This wasn't just an agricultural event. It was a cosmic one, a moment of profound renewal and sustenance. And it had its own internal clock, rhythm that was deeply connected to their calendar and, by extension, their understanding of time. While shadows measured the hours of the day, the Nile's flood provided a grand annual marker, a natural year marker that complemented the solar observations. The very act of anticipating, observing, and then responding to the flood shaped their lives on a macro scale, influencing their divisions of the year and their sense of long-term time. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Egyptian civil calendar, the 365-day calendar, was meticulously designed around the three seasons of the Nile: Akhet, inundation; Pare, growth; and Shemu, harvest. This direct link between the natural phenomenon of the flood and their formalized calendar demonstrates how profoundly the Nile influenced their sense of larger time cycles. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star, Sothis to the Egyptians, shortly before the annual flood, was an astronomical marker they used to predict the inundation, tying stellar observation to the river's rhythm. Now for a quirky tidbit. The ancient Egyptians developed devices called nilometers to measure the height of the Nile's water levels. These were structures, often a series of steps or a graduated column, built into the banks of the river or in wells connected to it. By observing the water level on the nilometer, priests and officials could predict the intensity of the coming flood and thus the potential for a good harvest or, conversely, famine. These measurements weren't just for practical purposes. They were also reported to the pharaoh and were deeply integrated into temple rituals, almost like a divine forecast. Historians still argue whether the nilometer readings were publicly accessible to all, giving everyone a direct sense of the flood's progress, or if they were primarily controlled by the priestly elite to maintain their authority and knowledge. It's a debate about control of information. The Nile's rhythm wasn't just about the flood, the flow rate of the river, its constant presence, even the movement of boats upon its surface, all contributed to a subconscious sense of time's passage. Days would be measured by shadows, but the larger sweep of weeks and months would be influenced by the river's slow ebb and flow. You might say, we will complete the harvest before the Nile begins to swell, or the new construction will start after the floodwaters recede. The river provided natural, undeniable markers for longer periods. Consider how this influenced their planning. The entire agricultural cycle, the lifeblood of their economy, revolved around the flood. Farmers knew that after the flood receded, they had a limited window to plant their crops in the newly fertilized soil before the dry season set in. This created a sense of urgency and precision that wasn't about daily hours, but about optimal seasonal timing. The Nile's clock dictated the biggest economic decisions of the year. The annual flood was also deeply ingrained in their religious beliefs. It was seen as a divine gift, often associated with the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile's inundation. Rituals and festivals were performed to appease Hapi and ensure a bountiful flood. The timing of these rituals would, again, be linked to observations of the river's rise, as measured by the nilometers and coordinated with the solar calendar. So, the Nile's time connection was not just practical, but profoundly sacred. The very concept of a year, for the Egyptians, wasn't just an abstract astronomical calculation. It was deeply embodied by the annual cycle of the Nile. The three seasons were distinct in terms of water levels, agricultural activities, and the quality of light and shadows they produced. This meant that their perception of time was holistic, integrating the celestial with the terrestrial, the abstract with the tangible. It was a fluid, organic understanding of duration. The administrative structures of ancient Egypt also had to align with the Nile's time. Taxes were collected after the harvest, resources were allocated based on flood predictions, and major construction projects were often scheduled for the dry season when labor was available and the ground was firm. The Nilometer readings, therefore, were crucial intelligence for the state, directly impacting its ability to govern and manage its vast resources. It was the original economic forecast, driven by river levels. Even though shadow clocks provided daily precision, they couldn't tell you about the future of the river. The Nile, with its unique annual rhythm, provided the grand context, the overarching year clock that gave meaning to the daily segments. Without the predictable cycle of the Nile, their solar calendar, no matter how accurate in terms of days, would have lacked its profound practical and symbolic resonance. Think about living in a world where your very survival depended on a massive river. You would become acutely aware of its every subtle change. The slight rise in water level, the change in current, the arrival of specific birds. All these would be cues, integrated into your overall perception of time and the year's progression. The Nile's time was felt, experienced, and lived so, while the sun's shadow dictated the immediate demands of the day. The immense, cyclical pulse of the Nile provided the grand framework for the year. It was a complementary system where the daily solar clock provided precision, and the annual river clock provided the vital, life-sustaining rhythm that allowed the ancient Egyptian civilization to flourish for thousands of years. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a living, breathing calendar, a timeless force that shaped their very concept of existence. You're still immersed in that ancient Egyptian world, the sun relentless during the day, the Nile flowing steadily. You've come to understand how deeply their daytime life was governed by the sun's shadows and the river's annual rhythm. But as the sun dips below the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, a different kind of timekeeping emerges. As darkness envelops the land, you look up and realize that the ancient Egyptians weren't blind in the night. They were meticulously tracking time by the silent, majestic sweep of the stars. Imagine the profound darkness of the Egyptian desert night. Far from any artificial light pollution, the sky explodes with countless stars, a brilliant tapestry that seems almost within reach. With the daytime sundials rendered useless, the Egyptians turned to these distant, sparkling points of light to continue their vigil of time. This was the realm of the decans, a system of stellar timekeeping that was as ingenious as it was beautiful. The Egyptians observed that certain groups of stars, or individual bright stars, would rise above the eastern horizon at specific times. During the night, as the Earth rotated, different stars would appear, seemingly marking the passage of hours. They divided the night into segments, much like they divided the day, but using these celestial beacons as their guides. A mainstream historical fact here is that the ancient Egyptians identified 36 decans groups of stars, each rising sequentially above the horizon over a period of 10 days. These decans served as a kind of celestial clock, with each decan's appearance marking the start of a new hour of the night. This system was crucial for priests and astronomers who needed to maintain a continuous, uninterrupted record of time, especially for religious ceremonies that occurred after sunset or before dawn. They effectively had 12 hours for the night, just like the day, but these were defined by the rising of specific star groups. Now for a quirky tidbit. To use these decanes, Egyptian astronomers or priests would often sit in a specific orientation, perhaps within a temple, gazing towards the eastern horizon. They might use a simple device, like a star clock tablet or a transit instrument, which was essentially a plumb line used to align with the North Star, and another observer using a sighting tool to mark the rising of the Deccan stars. Imagine the silent vigil, night after night, as priests sat patiently, waiting for a particular star group to just clear the horizon, signaling the next hour of darkness. It's a bit like a celestial game of peekaboo, but with cosmic consequences. Historians still argue whether the Deccan system was primarily for practical timekeeping, or if its main function was astrological, relating the rising of specific stars to omens and destinies. It's a debate between the clock and the horoscope. The challenge with stellar timekeeping, particularly with the Decans, was that the visible stars changed with the seasons. As the Earth orbited the Sun, different parts of the night sky became visible. This meant that the specific decans marking the hours in summer would be different from those marking the hours in winter. The Egyptians, through centuries of careful observation, developed complex decan lists and tables for different months of the year, ensuring they always knew which stars to look for to tell the time. This required incredible astronomical knowledge and meticulous record-keeping. This nighttime timekeeping was especially vital for temple rituals. Many religious ceremonies and offerings took place during the hours of darkness, sometimes in the deepest parts of the night. The ability to precisely time these rituals using the stars ensured that they were performed at the auspicious moments, believed to be most potent for divine interaction. The stars were, in essence, the divine clock face for the gods. The Deccan system also formed the basis of their 360-day calendar, which was further adjusted to 365 days as each Deccan effectively ruled over a 10-day period. This created a cyclical system that linked the daily movement of the stars to the larger progression of the year. So, the stars were not just telling them the time of night, but also subtly reinforcing the passage of the seasons and the year itself. Consider the precision they were able to achieve. While observing the precise moment a star rises on the horizon can be tricky due to atmospheric conditions and light pollution, though less of an issue in ancient Egypt. The consistency of stellar movements meant that over time, they could build up an incredibly accurate database of celestial events. This accuracy was crucial for maintaining their calendar and for astronomical predictions. The North Star, Polaris, though not precisely the same star as our Polaris today due to precession, but a star near the celestial North Pole, would have been particularly important for orientation. By aligning their observational instruments with this fixed point in the sky, they could ensure that their measurements of rising decans were consistent. It was their celestial anchor in a constantly turning sky. The development of star clocks and the decan system highlights the advanced nature of Egyptian astronomy. Without telescopes, without complex mathematical models, they were able to map the night sky with remarkable detail and use it as a functional timepiece. It was a testament to their observational skills and their dedication to understanding the cosmos. Imagine spending your nights under that vast, star-studded sky, memorizing the patterns, learning the precise moment each celestial marker would appear. It was a profound connection to the universe. The use of star clocks also speaks to the duality of timekeeping in ancient Egypt. The immediate visual reliance on the sun's shadow during the day, and the more contemplative, calculated observation of the stars at night. Each system compensated for the limitations of the other, providing a continuous, albeit unequal, flow of time through the 24-hour cycle. It was a perfectly complementary system, one for the light, one for the dark. historians often point to the astronomical ceilings found in tombs, decorated with stars and decan lists, as evidence of the profound importance of this stellar timekeeping. These weren't just decorative, they were practical charts, guiding the deceased and perhaps living priests through the celestial realms and ensuring their journey through the afterlife was appropriately timed with the cosmic cycles. So, as you watch the sun disappear and the first stars begin to prick through the twilight, you gain a deeper appreciation for the silent, shimmering clock above. The ancient Egyptians, undeterred by darkness, simply looked higher, harnessing the distant light of the stars to continue their relentless pursuit of time, connecting their earthly lives to the vast unfolding rhythms of the cosmos. You're still there, feeling the ancient air, now cooled by the desert night. You've journeyed through the sun-drenched hours with shadows and the star-studded darkness with the decans. But what happens when the sun is hidden by clouds, or the night sky is obscured by a rare dust storm? The ancient Egyptians, ever practical and ingenious, devised another solution, one that provided a more consistent, if somewhat slower, measurement of time. Independent of celestial visibility, the water clock, or clepsydra. Imagine a world without any form of continuous timekeeping that didn't rely on the sky. A cloudy day would bring an immediate halt to all precise scheduling. That's where the water clock stepped in, offering a different kind of rhythm, the steady, relentless drip of water. The earliest Egyptian water clocks were remarkably simple. Picture a large, conical or cylindrical vessel made of pottery or stone with a small hole near its base. This vessel would be filled with water, and as the water slowly dripped out through the hole, the falling water level inside the vessel would indicate the passage of time. The interior walls of the vessel would be marked with horizontal lines or symbols, like a giant measuring cup. As the water level dropped from one mark to the next, a specific amount of time, an hour, had passed. A mainstream historical fact. The oldest known water clock, or clepsydra, dates back to the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1400 BCE, and was found in the Karnak temple. This particular clepsydra was an alabaster bowl with a small hole at the bottom and markings on the inside. Its design allowed for a relatively steady flow of water, providing a more consistent measurement than some of the earlier, simpler versions might have offered. Now for a quirky tidbit. To account for the problem of decreasing water pressure and thus slower flow as the water level dropped, the early Egyptian water clocks weren't simply straight-sided. Their internal shape was often narrower at the bottom and wider at the top, or the markings themselves were adjusted. This ingenious design ensured that equal volumes of water dripped out in equal times, or that the marks corresponded to equal hours, even as the pressure changed. It required an intuitive understanding of hydrodynamics long before formal physics. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern-day plumber. Yes, the flow rate changes with the head pressure, so we designed a pot that changes shape as it empties. You'd probably get a blank stare and a bill for a new pipe. Historians still argue whether the complex internal curves of some water clocks were derived from empirical trial and error over centuries, or if they represented a sophisticated, albeit unwritten, application of mathematical principles. The clepsydra was particularly useful during the night when sundials were useless, and on overcast days. It provided a continuous audible, the soft drip of water, and visual, the falling water level measurement of time, ensuring that religious rituals, work shifts, and other scheduled activities could proceed without interruption, regardless of the visibility of the sun or stars. It was the ancient world's reliable backup clock, always ready to go. The marks inside the water clock, like those on sundials, also had to account for the unequal hours of day and night. So a single clepsydra might have multiple sets of marks, corresponding to different months of the year, to reflect the changing length of the night. A nighttime hour in summer, when nights were shorter, would correspond to less water having drained than a nighttime hour in winter, when nights were longer. This meant the priests operating these clocks had to know which scale to read for the current month. The maintenance of water clocks would have been a continuous task. The small hole at the bottom could become clogged with sediment or mineral deposits, affecting the flow rate. The water itself would evaporate, particularly in the dry Egyptian climate. So, constant refilling, cleaning, and recalibration would have been necessary. This was a job for dedicated temple personnel, again, often priests or their assistants, who were meticulous in their duties. The water clock also offered a certain privacy in timekeeping that sundials did not. A sundial was a public display, visible to all. A water clock, especially a portable one, could be used indoors or in more secluded temple chambers, allowing for the timing of secret rituals or private meetings without public knowledge. It was the ancient equivalent of a discreet wristwatch versus a giant public clock tower. The very sound of the water clock, the rhythmic, gentle drip, might have had a calming, almost meditative effect, particularly during long night vigils. It provided a steady, unchanging pulse in the darkness, a contrast to the dynamic, sweeping shadows of the day. While the water clock offered continuity, it wasn't without its limitations. Besides the maintenance, the water itself needed to be clean and at a consistent temperature to ensure uniform viscosity and flow rate. Extreme temperature fluctuations could subtly affect the accuracy, though this would likely have been minor in the stable climate of Egypt. The invention and widespread use of water clocks demonstrate the Egyptians' advanced practical engineering skills and their persistent drive to master the concept of time. They weren't just observing, they were actively creating tools to measure and control it, reflecting their deep desire for order and predictability in a world that often felt chaotic. Water clocks would have been particularly valuable in settings where solar or stellar observations were difficult or impossible, such as deep within temples, in mines, or within royal palaces. They provided a consistent, indoor timekeeping solution. Imagine a king needing to know the time for a council meeting, regardless of the weather outside. A water clock would be his reliable guide. The development of the clepsydra represents a significant step towards mechanical timekeeping, moving away from purely astronomical observation. It shows a growing understanding of how to harness physical principles, in this case, the flow of water, to create a measurable, reproducible unit of time. This paved the way for future advancements in timekeeping technology, eventually leading to intricate gear-driven clocks. It was a true innovation, moving time from the heavens to a pot of water. So, as you listen to that soft, steady drip of water within the clepsydra, you realize that the ancient Egyptians left no stone unturned, no natural phenomenon unexploited in their quest to measure and understand time. They harnessed the sun, the stars, and the very flow of water, weaving a complex tapestry of timekeeping methods that allowed their civilization to flourish for millennia, a testament to their enduring ingenuity. You're still there, attuned to the ancient rhythms, the sun, the stars, the steady drip of the water clock. You've seen the monumental, the sacred, the ingenious. But now, As you walk through a bustling market or perhaps visit a wealthy merchant's home, you notice something smaller, more personal, yet equally vital: portable shadow devices. Not everyone could rely on a grand obelisk or a fixed temple sundial. For the traveling official, the diligent craftsman, or the prosperous householder, a personal, transportable timekeeper was a necessity, bringing the power of solar time into their immediate lives. Imagine a high-ranking scribe making his rounds, or a supervisor overseeing construction far from a central temple. They couldn't simply glance at the nearest colossal sundial. Instead, they might pull from their satchel a compact, L-shaped sundial, much like the ones you've already envisioned, but scaled down for personal use. These were often made from wood, bronze, or even ivory, small enough to be carried, yet robust, enough for daily use in the field. These portable devices were essentially miniature versions of the larger, fixed sundials. They consisted of a flat base, usually rectangular, with a small, upright gnomon at one end. The base would be marked with divisions, just like their larger counterparts. The user would place the sundial on a level surface, often orienting it by eye towards the sun. As the gnomon's shadow fell across the marked scale, it would indicate the time, a mainstream historical fact. Several examples of these portable sundials have been unearthed, dating back to the New Kingdom period around 1550 to 1070 BCE. These finds indicate that timekeeping wasn't exclusively a priestly or royal prerogative. It filtered down to those in administrative and specialized roles who needed to manage their schedules and coordinate activities in diverse locations. The fact that they were often found in non-temple contexts highlights their practical, everyday utility. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some portable sundials had a small plumb bob attached, or an integral level, to ensure the device was perfectly horizontal. Before use, imagine having to carefully balance your little sundial, waiting for the bob to hang still before you could even read the time. It's like pulling out your phone to check the time, but first having to find a perfectly flat surface and waiting for it to calibrate. A bit fiddly perhaps, but essential for accuracy. Historians still argue about the commonality of these portable devices. Were they truly widespread amongst the middle and upper classes, or were they still quite rare and primarily for a select few professionals? It's a debate about ancient consumer technology. The challenge with portable sundials, more so than fixed ones, was proper orientation. A fixed sundial could be meticulously aligned once and then remain accurate. A portable one, however, needed to be realigned every time it was set down. This required the user to have a good sense of direction, knowing true north or the general east-west axis to get a reliable reading. Many would have simply pointed the gnomon roughly towards the sun's direction in the morning or evening, accepting a slight margin of error for convenience. These devices, though simple, represented a significant step towards the personalization of time. No longer did you have to rely solely on the public clock or the temple announcement. You had a tool in your hand that allowed you to organize your own day, to know when to start a task, when to break, or when to meet someone, regardless of your immediate surroundings. This would have greatly enhanced efficiency for administrators, overseers, and skilled craftsmen working on projects spread across the land. Consider the practical scenarios. A foreman at a quarry far from a city could use his portable sundial to ensure his workers were putting in their full day's labor. A merchant traveling with a caravan could time his stops and departures, coordinating with other caravans or market schedules. A royal inspector visiting various provincial outposts could maintain his rigorous itinerary. These weren't just curious gadgets. They were essential tools for productivity and coordination in a complex society. The limitations of these devices were similar to larger sundials. They were useless at night or on heavily overcast days. This meant that users of portable sundials would still have relied on other cues for those times, perhaps the rising of specific stars they knew, or the shared understanding of nighttime segments, or even communal water clocks if available in urban centers. It was a multifaceted approach to time, where each tool filled a specific niche. The craftsmanship of some surviving portable sundials suggests they were not just utilitarian, but also objects of status, decorated with carvings or hieroglyphs. They might have been symbols of the owner's literacy, importance, and ability to manage their affairs efficiently. Owning such a device would have communicated a certain level of sophistication and modernity. For the time, it was the ancient world's version of a fancy Swiss watch, only it ran on sunlight and careful alignment. The development of these portable timekeepers also implies a growing need for standardization of timekeeping across wider geographical areas. If a scribe in Memphis needed to coordinate with an official in Thebes, they both needed to be able to interpret mid-morning in a roughly similar way, even if their specific devices varied slightly. This fostered a common understanding of the hours across the kingdom. It also speaks to the value placed on efficiency and punctuality, even in an ancient agrarian society. While not as rigid as modern time, there was clearly an advantage to knowing and adhering to a schedule, particularly in large-scale projects like pyramid building or the organization of military campaigns. The ability to coordinate large numbers of people over vast distances required a common temporal framework, and portable sundials contributed to that. So, as you see these smaller, handheld instruments, you realize that the ancient Egyptian pursuit of time wasn't just confined to monumental temples and the grand scale of the cosmos. It permeated daily life, empowering individuals to organize their own routines and coordinate with others, bringing the science of shadows down to a personal, practical level. These small devices were big steps in making time a truly integral part of individual agency in the ancient world. You're still in ancient Egypt, the sun high above, casting shadows that reveal the passage of moments and seasons. You've explored the grand scale of obelisks and the practicality of portable devices. Now you're about to grasp a more subtle, yet profoundly complex aspect of their shadow timekeeping, the challenge of adjusting for latitude. While the Egyptians were masters of empirical observation, the very nature of the Earth's spherical shape and the sun's apparent path across the sky meant that a sundial that worked perfectly in one location wouldn't be perfectly accurate in another, even a few hundred miles north or south. Imagine yourself standing by a sundial in Memphis, near the Nile Delta in Lower Egypt. The sun casts its shadow and you read the time. Now, picture yourself traveling hundreds of miles south, deep into Upper Egypt, perhaps near Aswan. If you brought that same sundial, or if a local one was constructed identical to the one in Memphis, you would quickly notice a discrepancy. The shadows would behave slightly differently, particularly at midday and throughout the different seasons. Why? Because the sun's angle in the sky, and thus the behavior of shadows, changes with your position on the Earth's surface, specifically with your latitude at locations closer to the equator. The sun generally appears higher in the sky throughout the year, leading to shorter midday shadows. As you move further north or south from the equator, the sun's maximum elevation decreases, resulting in longer midday shadows. This means that a sundial calibrated for Memphis would be subtly inaccurate. In Aswan and Vis, the lines marking the hours would need to be drawn differently for each latitude to reflect the local solar conditions. A mainstream historical fact: the ancient Egyptians' meticulous astronomical observations, driven partly by the need for accurate timekeeping and calendar development, allowed them to understand these subtle variations. While they didn't have a modern concept of geographical coordinates like latitude and longitude, their practical knowledge of the sun's path at different points along the Nile was significant. Texts and tomb decorations show a keen awareness of the stars visible at different points along the river, implying an understanding of the changing celestial sphere with geographical location. Now, for a quirky tidbit to compensate for these latitudinal differences, some highly advanced Egyptian sundials, particularly those used in major temple complexes, might have been designed with a specific orientation or angle that factored in the local latitude. This wasn't always explicit, but often built into the empirical design. Imagine the challenge for a craftsman. This sundial is for the temple in Edfu, so the morning mark needs to be just so, slightly different from the one we built for Cairo. It's like having a bespoke clock for every city, each one subtly unique. Historians still argue whether the variations in sundial designs found at different sites primarily reflect regional stylistic preferences or a deliberate attempt to incorporate specific latitudinal adjustments based on accumulated astronomical data. It's a debate between art and science. The need to adjust for latitude implied a sophisticated level of astronomical knowledge for the time. It meant understanding that the sun's apparent daily arc wasn't uniform across the entire kingdom. It varied. This understanding would have been crucial for the priestly astronomers who were responsible for the most accurate timekeeping and calendar maintenance. They would have needed to compile data from various locations, comparing shadow lengths and movements to refine their overall system. Think about the implications for large-scale projects. If you were building a temple that needed to be precisely oriented to the rising sun on the solstice, and that temple was located far south of the capital, you couldn't just use the same calculations. You would need to adjust for the local solar angles. This precision in orientation, often seen in the surviving architecture, suggests a deep, practical understanding of these latitudinal effects. This wasn't just about sundials. It also affected the use of star clocks. The visibility and rise times of specific decaan stars would also vary with latitude. A star that was observable year-round at one latitude might dip below the horizon for part of the year at another. So, the charts used for nighttime timekeeping would also need to be customized for different regions, adding another layer of complexity to their astronomical records. The consistent observations required to build this knowledge would have taken centuries. Each generation of priests and scribes would have added to the accumulated data, refining the understanding of how the sun's path changed across the length of the Nile Valley. This wasn't a sudden discovery. It was a slow, painstaking process of empirical data collection, passed down through oral tradition and increasingly through written records. The sheer length of the Nile, stretching over thousands of kilometers through distinct latitudes, presented a unique challenge and opportunity for the Egyptians. They were effectively living across a natural laboratory for observing latitudinal variations in solar and stellar phenomena. This geographical span forced them to confront these astronomical nuances head-on, leading to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the cosmos. Imagine a journey up the Nile, from the fertile delta to the rugged south. As you moved, you would instinctively feel the sun's angle shift, becoming more direct. This lived experience would reinforce the intellectual understanding of latitude. The sun truly was their compass, their calendar, and their map, all rolled into one. The ability to create and use timekeeping devices that adjusted for latitude speaks volumes about the Egyptians' ingenuity and their drive for precision. It shows that their astronomical observations were not just for religious or calendrical purposes, but were directly applied to practical engineering and daily life, ensuring that time, the very rhythm of their civilization, remained consistent and reliable. Across their vast kingdom, they were, in effect, the first pioneers of localized time zones, albeit based on natural solar variations rather than arbitrary political boundaries. So, as you feel the subtle shift in the sun's angle when you imagine moving along the Nile, you appreciate the profound astronomical knowledge that allowed the ancient Egyptians to build a unified civilization across diverse latitudes, all anchored by their sophisticated understanding of the sun's intricate, ever-changing dance with the earth. It's a reminder that truly advanced knowledge often begins with the simplest, most persistent observations. You're still in ancient Egypt, the sun perpetually orchestrating the light and shadow, the Nile flowing steadfastly. You've explored the intricate mechanics of their timekeeping devices and the subtle astronomical nuances. Now, you're stepping directly into the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians, witnessing how the shadow clock, in its various forms, truly dictated routines from farming to feasting. Time wasn't an abstract concept. It was a visible, tangible force shaping every activity. Imagine a farmer waking at the first blush of dawn. He doesn't need a rooster, though he probably has one. He sees the long, faint shadow of his mud brick house stretching across his field. This is his signal. It's time to gather his tools, a wooden plow, perhaps, and head to his plot. As the sun rises higher, he watches his own shadow shorten. He knows that when his shadow is short and stout, it's the hottest part of the day and time for a break. He pulls out his flatbread and a few dates, finding shade under a scrawny acacia tree. His entire work rhythm is determined by the sun's climb and descent, marked by the changing shadows around him. There's no foreman barking orders about quitting time. The sun itself is the boss. A mainstream historical fact here is that the working day in ancient Egypt, particularly for manual laborers in agriculture or construction, was largely defined by daylight hours. The concept of shifts as we know them was often informal, dictated by the available light and temperature. The hours were unequal, meaning a summer workday was naturally longer than a winter one, a practical adaptation to the available light. Now for a quirky tidbit. Even meals were often tied to the shadow clock. While formal mealtimes, as we understand them, might not have existed universally, the main meal for many would often coincide with the midday break, when the shadows were shortest and the heat most intense. This natural pause allowed for a communal gathering, a time for rest and sustenance before the afternoon's labor. Imagine trying to schedule a dinner party in ancient Egypt. Come when the shadow of the great palm tree touches the fifth stone, and bring your own figs. Historians still argue whether the concept of a workday was strictly enforced by time, or if it was more task-oriented, meaning you worked until the task was done. Regardless of the shadow's position, though time would certainly have provided the framework for estimating completion. for craftsmen in workshops. Whether carving stone or weaving linen, the shadow clock determined the rhythm of their productive day. The quality of light for intricate work was best during mid-morning and mid-afternoon, when the shadows were distinct but not too harsh. As the shadows grew long and indistinct towards evening, fine work would become impossible, signaling the end of the workday. Each skilled artisan, from the potter to the jeweler, would have an internalized sense of the shadow's progression, guiding their hands and their schedules. In the bustling markets, the shadow clock was crucial for merchants and buyers alike. Sellers would know when the prime selling hours were typically mid-morning and mid-afternoon, avoiding the oppressive midday heat. Buyers would know when the market was most active, or when to seek bargains as the day drew to a close. Imagine a merchant shouting, "Last chance. The sun's shadow is almost at the last mark." It was their closing bell, literally painted on the ground by sunlight. For the priests in the temples, as you know, the shadow clock was sacred. Every ritual, every offering, every procession was meticulously timed by the movements of the obelisks, shadow, or the internal temple sundial. These weren't suggestions, they were divinely ordained schedules. Missing a critical moment could, in their belief system, displease the gods and disrupt the cosmic order. The shadow was the arbiter of divine punctuality. Even social gatherings and feasts would be informally dictated by the sun. Feasts, often held in the cooler evenings, would begin as the sun set and the shadows lengthened into darkness, allowing for revelry under the stars, perhaps illuminated by oil lamps. Daytime gatherings might be structured around the midday break or the cooler hours of the late afternoon. The shadow provided the natural cue for these social rhythms. Think about construction projects, like the building of pyramids or temples, coordinating thousands of laborers, moving immense stones, or required a synchronized effort, while overseers certainly used vocal commands and signals. The shared understanding of the shadow's movement provided the underlying framework for shifts, breaks, and the cessation of work. The shadow is reaching the first course, time to move. The next block. It was a massive, visible project management tool. The shadow clock also influenced the more mundane aspects of daily life. When to draw water from the well, perhaps when the well's shadow was shortest, indicating midday and a good time to rest from other labors. When to bake bread, perhaps in the cooler morning hours, to avoid overheating the home. When to grind grain. All these activities would fall into natural patterns, dictated by the sun's position and the resulting shadows. This pervasive influence of the shadow clock meant that ancient Egyptian society was deeply attuned to natural cycles. There wasn't a disconnect between human activity and the environment. Time was not an artificial construct imposed upon nature. It was an inherent part of nature, observed and utilized. This created a rhythm of life that was perhaps more organic, less stressful than our clock-driven, minute-by-minute existence. You felt the time, you saw the time, you lived the time. The concept of being on time might have been different. It wouldn't have been about a precise minute, but about a segment of the day. If you were meeting someone, you might agree to meet when the shadow reaches the third mark, implying a window of time rather than an exact moment. This flexibility would have reduced stress, though it might occasionally lead to humorous misunderstandings. Did you mean the third mark on my sundial, or your sundial, because mine says you're late? So, as you observe the daily ebb and flow of life in ancient Egypt, from the farmer in his field to the priest in his temple, from the market vendor to the noble preparing for a feast. You realize that the sun's shadow was their constant companion, their silent guide. It dictated their routines, shaped their society, and provided the fundamental rhythm to one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. It truly was the heartbeat of their day. You're still in ancient Egypt, the sun's dominion over time firmly established in your mind. You've seen how shadows orchestrated the daily routines of everyone from farmers to priests. But now you begin to perceive a subtler, yet equally significant aspect of timekeeping, how the access to an understanding of precise time measurement created a social hierarchy. Time wasn't a great equalizer. It was, in many ways, a marker of status, power, and privilege. Imagine yourself as a humble peasant toiling in the fields. Your timekeeping is largely intuitive. You know morning by the quality of light and the length of shadows, midday by the sun's height, and evening by its descent. You don't own a portable sundial, nor do you have direct access to an allometer. Your connection to time is direct, visceral, and unmediated by complex instruments. You work until the shadows tell you to rest, and you return home when the light fades. Your daily life is simple, governed by the most basic solar rhythms. Now, contrast this with the priestly class. They were the undisputed masters of time. They operated the massive obelisk sundials in the temple courtyards, meticulously reading the shadows for sacred rituals. They used the complex decade star charts at night. They managed the water clocks for continuous timekeeping. Their knowledge was specialized, accumulated over generations, and often considered sacred. Their ability to predict celestial events, to accurately mark the passage of time for religious ceremonies, and to announce the timings of festivals gave them immense authority and influence. They were the arbiters of divine time, and their knowledge was not for the common folk. A mainstream historical fact, the astronomical priesthood in ancient Egypt was a highly specialized and influential group. They were responsible for observing celestial phenomena, maintaining the calendar, and ensuring the correct timing of religious festivals and ceremonies. This specialized knowledge of timekeeping was essential for their role in mediating between humans and the gods, solidifying their high status in society. Now for a quirky tidbit: access to certain more accurate water clocks or detailed decode tables might have been restricted to specific temple inner sanctums or royal administrative offices. These weren't publicly displayed. Their readings were likely conveyed to the general populace through announcements or less precise public signals. It's a bit like today, where the average person checks their phone for the time, but only a very few high-level government officials have access to secure, hyper-accurate atomic clocks for critical national functions. Historians still argue whether the secrecy surrounding certain astronomical and timekeeping knowledge was primarily to enhance priestly power, or if it was simply the natural consequence of highly specialized and complex skills that required years of dedicated study to master. The pharaoh and the royal court also stood at the apex of this temporal hierarchy. Their schedules, appointments, and ceremonial duties were meticulously planned, likely with the direct input of the priestly astronomers. The pharaoh's life was lived by a highly refined clock, allowing for efficient governance, military planning, and the coordination of vast construction projects. The royal court would have had access to the most accurate instruments and the most skilled timekeepers. Think about the implications of this knowledge asymmetry. If you, as a common person, relied on the general length of your shadow, and a priest could tell the time to a much finer degree. That priest held a distinct advantage. He knew precisely when the crucial moments were, when divine favor was highest, or when certain administrative decrees needed to be enacted. This precision conferred a significant degree of power and control for scribes and administrators. A reliable sense of time was crucial for their work. They needed to manage resources, allocate labor, track inventory, and record transactions. A portable sundial, or access to a communal one, would have been an essential tool for them. Their ability to accurately manage their work and schedules based on time distinguished them from the less organized and placed them higher in the social structure. Owning a portable sundial wasn't just practical, it was a visible sign of literacy, authority, and participation in the administrative machinery of the state. The construction workers, particularly those involved in monumental projects, would also have operated within a time-structured framework, albeit one dictated by their overseers. While they might not have had personal timekeeping devices, they would be subject to strict schedules enforced by those who did. Breaks, meal times, and quitting times would be announced, often by visual signals or verbal commands based on the overseer's observations of the sun. The time was managed for them, not by them. This tiered access to time knowledge meant that society functioned with different levels of temporal precision. The rhythms of the peasant were broad and cyclical, deeply integrated with nature. The rhythms of the priest were minute and precise, integrated with the cosmos and the divine. Rhythms of the administrator were practical and efficient, integrated with the state bureaucracy. The very act of being able to tell time precisely, beyond just a vague sense of morning or afternoon, would have been a mark of education and sophistication. It was a skill that separated the informed from the less informed, the rulers from the ruled. This wasn't necessarily a conscious decision to withhold knowledge, but rather a natural consequence of the complexity of the methods and the resources required to master them. The development of the Egyptian calendar, the 365-day year, while benefiting all, was also a product of this specialized knowledge. It was the priests and astronomers who meticulously observed the heliacal rising of Sirius and the solstices, refining the calendar over centuries. This crucial calendar, which brought order and predictability to agriculture and state administration, was a gift from the learned elite to society, further cementing their position. So, as you observe the varied lives unfolding around you, you begin to see that time in ancient Egypt wasn't just a universal phenomenon. It was stratified, interpreted, and utilized differently across the social strata. Access to its precise measurement was a privilege, a tool for power and organization that distinguished the rulers, the priests, and the administrators from the vast majority of the population, subtly shaping the very fabric of their hierarchical society. You're still in ancient Egypt, the sun's golden light painting the scene, revealing the layers of society and their differing relationships with time. You've seen how timekeeping knowledge ascended the social ladder. Now, you're focusing on the very apex of this temporal expertise, the priestly timekeeper's crucial role. These individuals weren't merely religious figures. They were the astronomers, the mathematicians, the guardians of the calendar, holding immense responsibility for keeping the entire cosmic and societal order in sync. Imagine a priest, specifically, one of the hour watchers or Ian-Mutef priests, within the cool, quiet confines of a temple observatory. This isn't a dusty, cluttered room. It's a precisely aligned space, open to the sky, perhaps with carefully cut apertures or viewing slits. His tools are simple yet profound: the steady drip of a water clock, the shadow of a gnomon on a marked floor, and, most importantly, his own trained eyes. His duty is paramount: to track the sun, the moon, and the stars, ensuring that the divine rhythms are accurately observed and meticulously recorded. Their primary role was to ensure the correct timing of all religious rituals and festivals. This was no small task. The daily offerings to various gods, the intricate purification ceremonies, the grand processions, and the specific hymns, all had to occur at precisely the right moment, as dictated by the heavens. A sunrise offering had to be made as the sun's first rays touched the altar. A nocturnal ritual had to align with the rising of a specific decade star. The priests were the human bridge between the cosmic order and earthly worship. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Egyptian calendar, crucial for religious festivals and agricultural planning, was primarily maintained by these priestly astronomers. Their observations of the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star Sothis, which coincided with the annual Nile inundation, were critical for adjusting and verifying the 365-day calendar. This blending of astronomy, timekeeping, and religious duty underscores their indispensable role. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some temple complexes had specific dark rooms or subterranean chambers designed for observing stars during the day, using pits filled with water to reflect faint starlight, or carefully constructed shafts. While this might sound like something out of a science fiction movie, it speaks to their dedication to continuous astronomical observation, even when the sun dominated the sky. It's a bit like trying to watch a faint distant star by looking down a well to block out the streetlights. Historians still argue whether these specific observational chambers were widely used or if they were more symbolic representations of celestial knowledge. Given the practical challenges of such observations, the priests were also the custodians of knowledge. They maintained detailed records, though often not written in the form of complex mathematical equations, but as observational tables, diagrams, and descriptions of celestial movements, shadow patterns, and water clock rates. This accumulated knowledge was passed down through generations, forming the bedrock of Egyptian astronomy and timekeeping. They were the original scientists, meticulously collecting data before the scientific method was even a glimmer in anyone's eye. Their duties extended beyond the purely religious. As the guardians of the calendar, they played a vital role in state administration. The timing of agricultural seasons, tax collection, public works projects, and even military campaigns relied on the calendar they maintained. The priests would advise the pharaoh and his officials on the auspicious times for various undertakings. Using their knowledge of celestial cycles and their accurate timekeeping, they were the king's cosmic advisors, ensuring everything happened at the optimal moment. The very education of these priestly timekeepers was rigorous and specialized. Young initiates would spend years learning to observe the sky, to interpret shadows, to manage water clocks, and to understand the complex interrelationship of the sun, moon, and stars. It was a demanding intellectual discipline, combining observation, memory, and a deep understanding of natural rhythms. Consider the responsibility. If the priests miscalculated the start of a season or mistimed a critical ritual, the implications were vast, from a poor harvest leading to famine to divine displeasure impacting the entire land. This immense pressure undoubtedly fostered an environment of extreme meticulousness and dedication to accuracy. There was no room for error when dealing with the gods and the survival of the kingdom. The priests also likely played a role in the development and calibration of timekeeping devices used beyond the temple walls. While the common farmer might rely on instinct, the official with a portable sundial would trust that its markings were derived from the precise calculations and observations performed by the priestly class. They were the source of truth for time across the land. Their sacred duty often involved night vigils, observing the silent march of the decade stars across the heavens. These were contemplative, profound moments, connecting the priests directly to the vastness of the cosmos and their place within it. It reinforced their spiritual authority and their perceived closeness to the divine. The integration of religious belief with scientific observation was a hallmark of the priestly timekeepers. For them, astronomy wasn't separate from religion. It was an intrinsic part of understanding the divine order of the universe. The sun's journey, the stars' movements, these were the actions of the gods, and by observing them, the priests were deciphering the divine will and ensuring humanity's harmony with it. So, as you watch the priestly timekeeper gaze upwards, or adjust the flow of his water clock, you understand that he is far more than just a man with a religious title. He is a scientist, a scholar, a meticulous observer, and a crucial pillar of Egyptian society. His quiet work, his diligent observations of the sun and stars, ensured the very pulse of a civilization, making him a central figure in the grand narrative of ancient Egyptian life. You're still in ancient Egypt. The sun's warm embrace, a constant presence, the hum of life continuing around you. You've seen the ingenuity behind the gnomon, the beauty of the shadow's dance, the precision of the water clock, and the sacred duties of the priestly timekeepers. Now, you're witnessing the ongoing story of progress, observing the gradual but significant evolution of time tools themselves. Timekeeping didn't simply appear fully formed. It was a continuous process of refinement, adaptation, and innovation over thousands of years. Imagine the earliest, most rudimentary shadow markers, perhaps just a stone in the sand. Over centuries, these evolved. The simple vertical stick became a more refined gnomon. The informal marks on the ground became engraved lines on stone slabs. The L-shaped sundial emerged, a more compact and precise design. Each iteration was a step towards greater accuracy, portability, and utility, a mainstream historical fact. The development of timekeeping tools in Egypt wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow, steady progression. The earliest evidence of formal sundials dates to the New Kingdom around 1500 BCE. But the conceptual understanding of shadows as time indicators likely predates this by centuries. Over the next 1,000 years, these devices saw incremental improvements in design, materials, and calibration methods. Now for a quirky tidbit. One lesser-known type of Egyptian sundial was the inclined plane sundial, instead of a flat base. The horizontal surface was angled, often to match the local latitude or the specific angle of the sun at a certain time of year. This ingenious design allowed for more evenly spaced hour marks, even with unequal hours, making them easier to read. It's like upgrading from a basic analog clock where the numbers are squished together to one with a more intuitive dial. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these inclined plane sundials suggests a deeper theoretical understanding of spherical trigonometry, or if their design was purely the result of empirical observation and a long process of trial and error, slowly optimizing for readability. It's the ancient version of a design thinking process. The materials used for time tools also evolved. From simple wood and stone, they progressed to more durable and workable materials like bronze, alabaster, and painted pottery. The use of finer materials not only allowed for greater precision in craftsmanship, but also signified the increasing value placed on these instruments, elevating them from mere utilitarian objects to works of art and status symbols. Imagine the difference between a rough stone sundial and a beautifully carved alabaster clepsydra. One tells time, the other also tells you about the owner's wealth and taste. The calibration methods became more sophisticated, while initial calibrations might have relied on simple observation. Later techniques likely involved more precise astronomical alignments, cross-referencing with stellar observations, or using standardized lengths and angles. The priestly astronomers, with their accumulated knowledge, would have played a key role in refining these methods, ensuring that successive generations of time tools were more accurate than their predecessors. The water clock, or clepsydra, also saw significant evolution. From simple leaky pots, they progressed to more complex vessels with specially shaped interiors to ensure a constant flow rate, or with multiple outflow holes for varying speeds. The markings inside became more intricate, accounting for the unequal hours of the night across different seasons. This continuous improvement in water clock design demonstrates a deep understanding of hydrodynamics, even if their understanding wasn't expressed in formal scientific terms. They were brilliant experimentalists, patiently testing and refining. The development of new tools often stemmed from new needs. As the Egyptian Empire expanded and administrative functions became more complex, the need for consistent and portable timekeeping grew, leading to the refinement and wider production of smaller, handheld sundials. The rise of monumental architecture and large-scale public works demanded highly accurate timekeeping for planning and execution, pushing the development of obelisk clocks and precise temple sundials. The evolution was also driven by the desire for continuity of time measurement. Sundials were great for daylight, but useless at night. Star clocks worked at night, but only on clear nights. Water clocks provided continuity through all conditions. The development of these complementary systems showed a pragmatic drive to overcome the limitations of any single method, creating a comprehensive approach to timekeeping. That this long process of evolution also speaks to the Egyptians' deep-seated cultural value of order and predictability. In a world often unpredictable due to the whims of nature or the occasional invasion, the ability to measure and predict time, to impose order on the daily and annual cycles, provided a profound sense of security and control. Time tools were instruments of this desired order. Think about the subtle changes over generations. A grandfather's old, weathered sundial might be passed down, but his grandson, having learned from the priests and new observations, might refine its markings, or even build a new, more precise one based on updated knowledge. This continuous cycle of observation, innovation, and refinement ensured that timekeeping remained a dynamic and evolving field throughout Egyptian history. It wasn't a static art, but a living science, constantly seeking improvement. The evolution of these tools reflects a growing intellectual curiosity and a systematic approach to understanding the natural world. From merely noticing a phenomenon's shadows to actively manipulating its sundials, water clocks to achieve greater precision and utility. This journey from simple observation to complex engineering is a testament to the enduring ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians. They were solving complex problems with the tools at hand, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. So, as you see the various forms of time tools scattered across the landscape, from the worn stone of an early gnomon to the sleek lines of a later water clock, you're witnessing the slow, majestic march of human ingenuity. Each artifact tells a story of dedicated observation, patient experimentation, and an unwavering commitment to mastering time, laying the groundwork for all the intricate chronometers and digital displays that define our modern world. It's a powerful reminder that every complex technology has humble, persistent beginnings. You're still in ancient Egypt, the sun's presence unwavering, the story of time unfolding across millennia. You've witnessed the indigenous evolution of their remarkable time tools. But now, as the curtain of history shifts, you begin to perceive new influences arriving from beyond the desert sands. The ancient world was rarely isolated, and even the self-sufficient Egyptians would eventually experience the profound impact of Greek influence. This Hellenistic touch would bring new ideas and refinements to their long-established methods of timekeeping. Imagine the bustling port city of Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great, a vibrant melting pot of cultures, ideas, and innovations. Here, Greek scholars, mathematicians, and engineers rubbed shoulders with Egyptian priests and artisans. While the Egyptians had thousands of years of empirical observation under their belts, the Greeks brought a new emphasis on theoretical mathematics, geometry, and a different philosophical approach to understanding the cosmos. One of the most significant contributions of Greek thought was the move towards equal hours. While the Egyptians had long used unequal hours, daylight divided into 12 parts, night into 12 parts, with the length of those hours varying seasonally, the Greeks began to develop concepts of fixed-length hours. This was often driven by their more abstract mathematical pursuits and their development of more complex astronomical models. A mainstream historical fact, the concept of equal fixed-length hours like our modern hours gained prominence in the Hellenistic period, particularly with the work of astronomers in Alexandria. This contrasted sharply with the traditional Egyptian system of unequal hours. While the unequal system suited an agrarian society, the fixed-hour system offered greater precision for scientific calculations and philosophical discussions, and eventually for more complex mechanical devices. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the Greeks, and later the Romans sometimes designed sundials that were much more mathematically complex, incorporating spherical geometry to project the sun's path onto various surfaces. These could be spherical, conical, or even cylindrical, designed to give more accurate readings for fixed hours. Imagine an Egyptian priest, accustomed to his flat L-shaped sundial, encountering a complex, bowl-shaped Greek dial with intricate, curving lines. He might scratch his head, thinking, why make it so complicated when a stick and a flat stone work just fine? Historians still argue about the extent to which these new geometrically complex Greek sundials actually replaced or merely complemented the simpler, empirically derived Egyptian ones, particularly outside of academic or elite circles in Alexandria. The Greeks also brought advancements in water clock clepsydra technology. While the Egyptians had pioneered the clepsydra, Greek engineers like Ctesibius of Alexandria, a brilliant inventor of the 3rd century BCE, developed far more sophisticated versions. These included mechanisms that maintained a constant water level and thus a constant flow rate through an overflow system, or even incorporated gears to move a pointer or strike an alarm. This was a significant leap from the simpler Egyptian drip pots. These Greek clepsydras could keep relatively accurate time for fixed hours, day and night, making them much more versatile than their Egyptian predecessors. This exchange wasn't a one-way street, however. The Greeks themselves were deeply impressed by and learned from the vast astronomical data accumulated by the Egyptians over millennia. The precise observations of the sun's path, the stars, and the movements of the planets that the Egyptian priests had recorded were invaluable to Greek astronomers, providing empirical data to test their theoretical models. It was a true intellectual cross-pollination. Think about the impact on daily life. For the common Egyptian, the traditional shadow clocks and unequal hours would likely have persisted for a long time, deeply ingrained in their cultural rhythm. But for the elite, the scholars, and the administrators in cities like Alexandria, the adoption of equal hours and more sophisticated Greek timekeeping instruments would have enabled more precise coordination and a different way of conceptualizing time itself. It would have been a gradual shift rather than an abrupt change. The philosophical implications were also profound. The Greek emphasis on reason, abstract mathematics, and universal principles provided a different lens through which to view time. Instead of time being solely tied to the observable and variable natural world, it became an abstract, universal quantity that could be divided into fixed units, independent of the sun's immediate position. This intellectual shift laid the groundwork for future developments in mechanical timekeeping. The presence of Greek and Roman rule in Egypt further facilitated this exchange. New administrative needs, new trade routes, and the integration into a larger Mediterranean world meant that standardized, precise timekeeping became increasingly important for communication and commerce across wider areas. The old, local, unequal hours, while functional locally, were less efficient for interregional coordination. The influence wasn't just in the design of the clocks themselves, but also in the very conceptualization of the calendar. While the Egyptian 365-day calendar was highly accurate, the Greeks and Romans brought their own calendrical systems, sometimes leading to complex efforts to reconcile different ways of reckoning the year. This often involved the use of astronomical tables that combined both Egyptian and Hellenistic observations. So, as you see the convergence of cultures in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, you realize that timekeeping, like so many other aspects of civilization, was a dynamic field, constantly evolving through the exchange of ideas. The indigenous ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians, honed over millennia, was met and refined by the theoretical prowess of the Greeks. This fusion of empirical observation and abstract mathematics would lay crucial foundations for the future of timekeeping, pushing it towards the precision and universality we now take for granted. It was the original international collaboration on how to make a better clock. You're still in ancient Egypt, now witnessing the slow twilight of its distinct, self-developed timekeeping as Hellenistic influences mingle with its deep traditions. You've seen the ingenuity of their sundials and water clocks, and the profound shift introduced by the concept of equal hours. Now, as the millennia roll forward, you begin to grasp the incredible journey of time measurement, seeing how these ancient concepts, born from the simple observation of shadows, truly paved the way for our present-day time. The echoes of Egyptian sun watching resonate in every tick of your modern clock. Imagine the trajectory from a stick in the sand, casting a moving shadow, to the complex, hyper-accurate atomic clocks that govern our global society today. It's a leap of monumental proportions, but the fundamental principles, the very desire to segment and understand time, were established by those early Egyptians. The most direct lineage, of course, comes from the sundial. The idea of using the sun's shadow as an indicator of time persisted for thousands of years, evolving through various cultures. The Roman Empire adopted and spread sundial technology, often based on Greek designs that had, in turn, incorporated Egyptian observations. Medieval European monasteries used sundials to mark their prayer times. Even today, you see sundials in gardens and parks, charming vestiges of this ancient technology. A direct line back to that first Egyptian realizing the power of a shadow. A mainstream historical fact: the division of the day into 24 hours, a system we still use, has ancient roots, drawing from both Egyptian and Babylonian traditions. While the Egyptian hours were initially unequal, the concept of a structured day, a night cycle, each with segments, was fundamental. The later adoption of fixed-length hours, partly influenced by Hellenistic astronomy building on earlier Egyptian data, was a crucial step towards the standardized time we know now. For a quirky tidbit, the very word hour itself, while having Latin roots, hora, is a concept that became truly meaningful as ancient civilizations began to segment the day. Before the Egyptians and their predecessors started formally marking these segments, time was more fluid, defined by events when the cows come home. The act of giving a name and a number to these segments was revolutionary. Imagine trying to explain to an ancient Egyptian that we have devices that can divide a single one of their hours into 3,600 seconds, and that those seconds are determined by the vibration of an atom. They'd probably think you were describing some form of powerful magic, or perhaps a very peculiar new type of water clock. Historians still argue about the precise moment and cultural influence that led to the universal adoption of the 24-hour day. Whether it was a single, definitive invention or a convergent evolution across several early civilizations, the water clock clepsydra also has a clear evolutionary path. From the simple Egyptian outflow vessels, they were refined by the Greeks with constant level mechanisms, and then by the Romans and later Islamic scholars, who added gears and even rudimentary alarms. These mechanical improvements were critical precursors to the development of geared mechanical clocks. The idea of using a consistent flow or movement to power a time-telling mechanism, first explored with water, eventually transitioned to weights and springs, leading directly to the clocks you have on your wall today. The Egyptian emphasis on astronomical observation for timekeeping was also a foundational pillar for all future astronomy and chronology. Their meticulous tracking of the sun's annual path, the solstices, the equinoxes, and the heliacal rising of stars like Sirius Sopdet provided invaluable data that later Greek, Roman, and Islamic astronomers would build upon. Without the centuries of systematic data collection by Egyptian priests, the later theoretical breakthroughs might have been impossible. They were the original data scientists of the cosmos. Even the calendar we use, the Gregorian calendar, ultimately traces its lineage back to the Egyptian 365-day civil calendar. The Roman Julian calendar, a direct ancestor of ours, was developed with input from Egyptian astronomers like Sosigenes of Alexandria, who famously advised Julius Caesar. The concept of a year, precisely measured and divided, with leap days to account for the true solar year, owes a profound debt to the meticulous observations made possible by Egyptian shadow and star clocks. The very idea of a publicly agreed upon time, essential for any complex society, also began with these ancient methods. Whether it was the shadow of an obelisk visible to an entire city, or the announcements made by priests based on their water clock readings, the Egyptians established the principle of a shared temporal framework for communal activity. This laid the groundwork for the modern concept of time zones and synchronized global schedules. Think about how deeply ingrained these ancient ideas are. When you say noon, you're referencing the sun's highest point, the very moment the gnomon's shadow is shortest. When you talk about the equinox, you're echoing the ancient observation of equal day and night, precisely measured by the shift in shadows and stellar positions. These aren't just quaint historical facts, they are the fundamental building blocks of how we perceive and manage our time. The Egyptian legacy is also one of persistence and incremental innovation. They didn't have sudden, dramatic technological breakthroughs like the invention of the microchip. Instead, they patiently observed, refined, and improved their tools over thousands of years, slowly inching towards greater precision and utility. This long, steady commitment to understanding and measuring time is a powerful testament to human ingenuity. So, as you glance at your modern clock, whether it's on your phone or on the wall, take a moment to reflect on its ancient origins, the digital display, the ticking hands, the precise seconds. All of it is a distant descendant of a humble stick planted in the Egyptian sand, its shadow marking the passage of the sun. The ancient Egyptians, with their sun-baked ingenuity, truly illuminated the path for all future timekeepers, setting the rhythm for the world we inhabit today. You've traveled through millennia, from the earliest observations of shadows to the sophisticated, if still rudimentary, devices that paved the way for our modern clocks. You've seen the sun dictate life, stars mark the night, and water flow with steady precision. Now, as our journey through ancient Egyptian time draws to a close, you're left with the profound realization of the enduring whisper of these shadows' lasting impact. Their legacy isn't just in the historical record, it's woven into the very fabric of how we perceive, measure, and experience time even today. Imagine the feeling of continuity. The same sun that warmed your skin in ancient Egypt still rises and sets today, casting shadows that, if you chose to observe them, would still tell you the approximate time. The fundamental principles the Egyptians discovered, that the sun's position dictates shadow length and direction, that its path changes seasonally, are eternal. These aren't just historical facts, they are laws of nature that they first diligently catalogued and utilized, the division of the day into segments. The concept of a measured hour, even if unequal, was a monumental intellectual leap. Before this, time was amorphous, defined by events. The Egyptians provided the framework, the granular understanding that allowed for schedules, coordination, and a more ordered society. Every meeting you schedule, every train departure you plan, every appointment you keep, implicitly acknowledges this ancient Egyptian innovation, the idea that time can be broken down, measured, and managed. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Egyptian 365-day calendar, refined over centuries through their meticulous astronomical observations, often leveraging shadow behavior, was arguably the most accurate civil calendar of its time and formed the direct basis for the Roman Julian calendar, which in turn was the precursor to our current Gregorian calendar. So, every time you check the date, you're interacting with a legacy that stretches back directly to ancient Egyptian timekeepers. Now for a quirky tidbit. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of time zones. Their time was strictly local, solar. Time, meaning noon, was when the sun was highest directly overhead in their specific location, not necessarily simultaneously across the entire kingdom. The idea of a standardized prime meridian or global time zones is a relatively modern invention, born out of the need for synchronized travel and communication. Imagine the chaos of trying to schedule an international video conference if everyone was still on local solar time. All right, I'll meet you at my third afternoon shadow mark. What time is that for you? Historians still argue whether the concept of equal hours was a necessary precondition for the eventual development of mechanical clocks, or if the technological capacity for mechanical timekeeping created the need for standardized equal hours. It's a chicken and egg question of innovation. The dedication of the priestly astronomers, their night vigils with star clocks, and their patient observations of the Nile's ebb and flow laid the groundwork for all future astronomy and hydrology. They were pioneers in systematic data collection, even without the modern tools of science. Their drive to understand and predict the natural world, born from the practical needs of their civilization, sparked an intellectual curiosity that continues to this day. Every scientist who patiently observes and records data, every engineer who seeks to harness natural phenomena, stands on the shoulders of those ancient Egyptian timekeepers. The very concept of punctuality itself, while perhaps less rigid than our modern obsession with minutes and seconds, began with the need to adhere to schedules dictated by the sun and stars. Rituals, work shifts, market timings, all required a degree of adherence to the visible clock. This fostered a societal appreciation for order and the coordinated efforts of groups, a direct predecessor to our modern reliance on precise scheduling. Think about the profound connection the Egyptians had with their environment. Because of their timekeeping, they weren't just living in nature, they were living by nature. The sun was their clock, the stars their calendar, the river their annual rhythm. This organic relationship contrasts sharply with our often disconnected, artificially lit and precisely numbered world. It invites a moment of reflection. Have we gained precision at the cost of connection? The evolution of their tools, from simple gnomons to complex water clocks, demonstrates humanity's inherent drive to master its environment and to create order out of chaos. The ingenuity displayed in shaping a water vessel to ensure a constant flow rate, or in marking a sundial to account for seasonal variations, speaks to a deep, practical intelligence that transcends millennia. These weren't abstract theories, they were solutions to real-world problems. Even the symbolism of time, its fleeting nature, its cyclical return, was embedded in their ancient practices. The daily death and rebirth of the sun, mirrored in the shadows it cast, reinforced their beliefs in cosmic cycles and the afterlife. Time was not just a measurement, it was a profound spiritual concept intertwined with their understanding of life, death, and renewal. So, as the light softens around you, and you prepare to drift off, remember the silent architects of time. Remember the Egyptian farmer, guided by his shadow, the priest, charting the stars, the craftsman, timing his labor by the sun. Their quiet observations, their patient ingenuity, their deep connection to the cosmos, built the very foundation upon which our complex, time-obsessed world now stands. The whisper of those ancient shadows truly does echo through every moment of your modern life.